Welcome back. Now it's time to finally build our first project with a visual user interface. And actually, we'll build not one, but 3 beautiful projects in this section so that you can learn the basics of so-called DOM manipulation. So, up until this point, we have only learned about the language itself. But now we will take it to the next level and actually make JavaScript interact with real web pages. So, for the first time now, we will finally see a real project come to life, and so that's gonna be a lot of fun and really exciting. Welcome to the first of 3 wonderful projects that we're gonna build in this section. And let's get started right away. And here I have a working demo of the project that we're gonna build over the next couple of videos. And this project is called Guess My Number, and I went with this kind of retro design, like inspired by the old 80s game, just to make it a bit more fun. So as the name says, the goal of this project is to simply guess a secret number, which is between 1 and 20. So here in this input, we can type a number, let's say 10, then we click check, and then here on the right side we get a message. In this case it says that our guess was too low. Also we can see that we started with a score of 20, and now after one failed guess it decreased to 19. So basically after each guess that we fail, the score decreases by 1. So let's try another one. It's still too low, and our score decreased again. Let's try 18. And now it's too high, so we get this different message. And now it's correct. So you see that we get this correct number message, the screen turns green, and also we now have the high score here of 17. So a high score is another feature of this small application. Then, if we want to play again, we can simply click the again button, and it all resets everything except for the high score. So the high score is kept, and so if I'm quicker in this round, my high score will then become better. Let's start again at 10. So maybe I can do it faster. Well, I think I cannot. It's too high. And so my high score stays the same as it was before. Okay, so with this, I think you understood how this project works. So let's actually get to work. And as always, grab your starter files from the GitHub repository. I already have mine here. And then let's open up this folder. So that's this one. And let's start by taking a look at the files that we have here. First up, we have the prettier configuration. So exactly the one that we used in the editor setup section. And from now on, we will always use this configuration in every single project. Then we have an empty script. We have the CSS style, which you can take a look at if you're interested, and the same for the HTML. Now the HTML will actually be important because that's where we will find the class names of all of these elements that we're going to have to select to make this project work. But more about that later. And yeah, let's close up this sidebar and focus on our script here. So as you just saw, all of this interface here basically is implemented in HTML. So again, that is this document. Okay, and this whole HTML document is made up of smaller HTML elements. For example, this message that we see here is in our HTML, this paragraph here with the message class. And so now in JavaScript, we can actually select this element based on this class. So a little bit like we can select elements in CSS, we can do the same in JavaScript. And if you're not at all familiar with HTML and CSS, then please watch the HTML and CSS crash course that is in the previous section. Anyway, before we learn what the DOM and DOM manipulation actually are, Let's quickly learn an easy way of selecting an element like this in JavaScript. And this is how it works. We write document.querySelector. So this querySelector is basically a method that's available on the document object. And more about that later. Now into this method, we need to pass in a selector. And again, this selector is exactly the same selector that we would use in CSS. So we pass in a string, and we want to select the element with the class name of message. And so we need to write a dot and then message. Again, this is exactly how we would select the same element using CSS, right? Now, if it was an ID instead of a class, we would use the hash, right? But in this case, it is really a class, and so let's use the dot. And now we can quickly take a look at the result of this selection here using the console. And remember that we set up the CL snippet in the editor setup section. So I just write CL, and then I get console.log automatically here. Now, in case you skipped that section, you can always go back and see how I did that, or you can just write a console.log manually. So I give it a save, and now I do another thing that we learned in the editor setup section, which is to open up this project using the live server, right? So let's open up the terminal here by clicking New Terminal. Okay, let's clear it using Command K. And again, we learned how to do all of this in the editor setup section. So if you skip that, then please go back and watch that one first. Anyway, we see that we're already in the folder. So guess my number, that's exactly the folder. And now all we need to do is to type live server, hit enter, and then it will open up a new tab in our browser. So this is the demo here that I'm going to keep on the right side, and then here on the left side is the actual project that we are building. Of course, nothing works yet, but let's just open up the console. So inspect, console, give it some more space. And so indeed, we actually already have the P element here selected. So that's what we did here. So document.querySelector message. And so in the console, we then get basically this entire element. And as we hover over it, it actually even gets selected here on the page. Great. So this is the first basically DOM manipulation that you did. Great job. Now this element here itself is not really that useful. So instead, let's actually get this text. So this start guessing here. And we can do that simple enough. All we have to do is another dot and then text content. So this part here first selects the element. And so the result of this querySelector method is going to be an element. And then on that element, we can read the text content property. And so that's why we use another dot here. And remember, when we have multiple dot operators, they are executed from left to right. And so first this operation here is done, then this selected here basically will get replaced with the element itself. And then on that element, we can read the text content property using another dot. So let's give it a save. This will then reload automatically. And yes, now we get start guessing, which is really just the text content of this element. Great. So now we kind of know how to establish this connection between our code and the user interface. So in other words, the HTML document that's being displayed in the browser. So this was a quick introduction to the DOM and how to select an element. But what is the DOM actually? And what is DOM manipulation, which is the big topic of this section? Well, let's find out in the next video. So in this section, we're going to make JavaScript interact with a web page for the very first time. And the technical term for that is doing DOM manipulation. Now, in the last lecture, you already selected an element from a page. And what that means is that you kind of interacted with the DOM already. So in this lecture, let's learn what the DOM actually is and how it works. So what is the DOM actually? Well, DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it is basically a structured representation of HTML documents. The DOM allows us to use JavaScript to access HTML elements and styles in order to manipulate them. For example, we will be able to change text, to change HTML attributes, and also to change CSS styles from our JavaScript. So we can say that the DOM is basically a connection point between HTML documents and JavaScript code. Now, the DOM is automatically created by the browser as soon as the HTML page loads, and it's stored in a tree structure like this one. In this tree, each HTML element is one object. And so let's now take a look at this DOM structure in a little bit more detail. And to illustrate this, here is a very simple HTML document, and here is what the DOM tree corresponding to this HTML looks like. So, as I already mentioned, this is a tree structure, which looks a bit like a family tree, right? And actually, we use the terms child element, parent element, sibling element, and so on when we talk about the DOM tree and DOM manipulation. Anyway, as you can see, for each element in the HTML, there is one element node in the DOM tree, and we can access and interact with each of these nodes using JavaScript. Okay, so the DOM always starts with the document object right at the very top. And document is a special object that we have access to in JavaScript. And this object serves as an entry point into the DOM. Remember how you used document.querySelector in the last lecture to select an element? So that means that the querySelector method is available on the document object. And so that's why we say that document is the entry point to the DOM, because we need it to start selecting elements. Alright, then the first child element of document is usually the HTML element, because that's usually the root element in all HTML documents. Next, HTML usually has two child elements, head and body. And so of course, you can also find them here in the DOM tree. In the HTML, they are adjacent elements, and so they are siblings in our DOM as well. Then, as we keep going deeper into the nested HTML structure, we keep adding more and more children to the DOM tree. So inside head and body, you have more child elements, and the two sections in the body even have child elements themselves. And from there, it goes even deeper, because the first paragraph also has a child, which is this link element here. And with that, finally, we have all our HTML elements in the DOM tree. But the DOM tree actually has more than just element nodes. It also has nodes for all the text itself, comments, and other stuff. Because basically, the rule is that whatever is in the HTML document also has to be in the DOM. And so, as you see, the DOM really is a complete representation of the HTML document, so that we can manipulate it in complex ways. And with this, you should now have a good overview of how the DOM works and what it looks like. But before we finish, I need to clarify something that many beginners find confusing. So, many people believe that the DOM and all the methods and properties that we can use to manipulate the DOM, such as document.querySelector and lots of other stuff, are actually part of JavaScript. However, this is not the case. Remember that JavaScript is actually just a dialect of the ECMAScript specification, and all this DOM-related stuff is simply not in there. So up until this point, we have only used the JavaScript language itself. But starting in this section, we will also use JavaScript in the browser. I mean, sure, we have used Google Chrome to run our code in the developer console, but that's not what I mean here. What I mean is to manipulate web pages that are actually displayed and rendered in the browser, just like any normal website that you know. Okay, but now you might ask, if the DOM is not a part of the JavaScript language, then how does this all work? Well, the DOM and DOM methods are actually part of something called the web APIs. So the web APIs are like libraries that browsers implement and that we can access from our JavaScript code. And API stands for Application Programming Interface, but more about that later. For now, what you need to know is that web APIs are basically libraries that are also written in JavaScript and that are automatically available for us to use. So all this happens behind the scenes. We don't have to import or do anything, okay? And there is actually an official DOM specification that browsers implement, which is the reason why DOM manipulation works the same in all browsers. Now, besides the DOM, there are actually a ton more web APIs, such as timers, the fetch API, and many more. Again, we will learn a lot more about this later on. For now, let's finally start our project and do some DOM manipulation in practice. Now that we have a better understanding of what DOM and DOM manipulation are, let's now actually select and manipulate some more elements. So in the previous lecture, we already selected this message element here by using querySelector, right? Then we also got the text content from the selected element. But besides getting the text content, we can also set the content of the element. So let's do that. So instead of start guessing, let's say like correct number. So that's actually going to be like the winning phrase. So again, we select the element. So querySelector. And the same selector. So again, the element with the class of message. And then again, text content. So that's exactly the same as here. Okay. Now here, we actually then logged the result to the console so that we could see it. But here, we will actually set this content to something else. And we do that by writing equal and then whatever we want the new content to be. So let's say correct number. And I'm also going to add here the party emoji. But again, you don't need to do that. It's just to improve the design of the app a little bit, basically. And so now if I save this, it should immediately change this text content here. So watch as I save now. And nothing happened, but that's because I'm here on the demo version. So I need the real one. And so here you see now correct number. Great, so that worked. And down here we still have to start guessing because that's what the content of the element used to be before. So in this line we started by reading the content of the element. And so at the beginning it was still start guessing because that's what is written here in the HTML element in the beginning, right? Then in the next line we changed it. And now if we would attempt to read it again, it should then be this new content that we said before. So let's copy and paste this line here really quick, give it a save. And so now you see that, of course, after changing the text content, when we then read it, it will be this new content. So exactly what we have now here. Okay, that makes sense. And so what we did here is really already DOM manipulation. Because in fact, here we manipulated the text content of one of the DOM nodes. So essentially this element here. So let's now do the same with this secret number and also the score. So both of these values are basically stored in an element. So let's take a look at the HTML. And so this is what I was telling you in the beginning, that we would need this HTML to basically get the class names of all the elements that we are interested in. So this secret number here, so this here is basically this div element here with the class number. And then the score, as you see here down here, from this 20, this is where this 20 is. And in this case, it is this span element with the class score. So now let's go ahead and select the elements with the class number and score. Okay, so that's exactly what we did before. So querySelector with the class number. And just to experiment some more with this, let's actually set it to something. Let's say 13. And then document dot querySelector dot score. And by the way, there are also other ways of selecting elements, but we will talk about them in one of the next projects. And let's set this element also to another value. Oh, and actually I'm forgetting the text content here. So we cannot set the entire element because the element has way more than just the content. So I really have to say that the text content should be 13. So text content. And now as I reload this, this should be 13 and this 20. Let's actually set this to another number. Otherwise we wouldn't see it changing. And indeed, we get 13 and 10 now. Great, that's amazing. So doing some great DOM manipulation here. And now let's move on and do the same actually with this input field. So an input field, as the name says, is where we can input some data. And so actually we can also get the data from here, and we can of course also set it. So let's just see how that works, and it's very similar. So as always, we start by selecting the element. And now we need to get the class name of this element. And so that is, it's right here. So it has the class of guess. And as I said, it's an input element. So again, dot, which is the class selector, and then the name of the class, which is guess. And here we got this error because the querySelector method expects at least one argument. And as we went to the HTML file, it then saved this JavaScript file, but we didn't have any string here, so any parameter yet. So that's why we got that error. And now if we want to get the value, which right now is actually empty, but if we want to get that, now this time we read the value property. And so let's log that to the console actually. So again, using the CL snippet. And if we reload this now, yeah, we just get this like empty value here because there is really nothing in there. Okay, but the big difference is that with an input field, to get the actual value, we use the value property. And we can of course also use it to set a value. So to manipulate this element. So dot value equals 23. Give it a save. And now we see 23 here. So as if we had written it ourselves. So we can delete it here just like any input field. But instead of us writing the number, it was JavaScript who wrote the 23 here for us simply by executing this code here. And to make this line of work here actually and to make this line of code here actually work, we can move it below the one where we're setting the value. So in VS Code, let's use Alt and the down arrow to move this line down. And then we should expect to see 23 here in the console instead of this empty line. And indeed, now we first write 23 here to this input field, and then afterwards we read it, and then the value is indeed 23. Great. But now what if we actually wanted to get this number here, for example, to log it to the console whenever we clicked on this button? Well, that's taking it to a whole new level. And so handling the click of a button is what we're going to learn in the next video. See you there soon. Let's now make our application actually do something when we click on the check button. So this is going to be the first time that our code reacts to something that happens in the DOM. And for that, we need to use an event listener. Now, an event is something that happens on the page. For example, a mouse click, or a mouse moving, or a key press, or many other events. Then, with an event listener, we can wait for a certain event to happen and then react to it. So let's try it out now. And let's actually start by getting rid of this code, because this has actually nothing yet to do with the application. But now we will actually start developing the application step by step. Anyway, in order to listen for events, we first need to select the element where the event should happen. And in this case, we want to listen to the event on this button element here. So this check button, because this is where the click that we're interested in will happen. So when we click on this button, something should happen. So let's select that button element. So querySelector. And then once more, we need to go ahead and grab the class name of this button. And so here it is. Now here we actually have two class names. We have button and check, but the button class here is the more generic one, which also applies to this other button, this again button here. So the class that we are interested in is just the check class. So again, the dot for the class selector and then check. And so this will select the button element itself. So just as before, this here will then return an element. And now on that element, we can call the addEventListener method. So addEventListener. And this is a method, and so we need to call it once more using the parentheses. Now, there are actually multiple ways to listen for events in JavaScript, but using this addEventListener method is the best one and also the most used one. Okay, now into this addEventListener method, we first need to pass in the type of the event. And in this case, it's just a simple click. So the name of the event is actually click. And so that is the first argument that we pass here into this function. But now we actually need to tell the event listener what to do. So basically, we need to specify the reaction to the click event. And we do that by defining a function. And that function will contain exactly the code that should be executed whenever this click event happens on this check button. And that function is going to be called the event handler. Now, this method, this addEventListener method here, is a special kind of function. That's because as a second argument, it expects this event handler function that we just talked about. So again, here as a second argument, we now need to pass in a function value as an argument. And that's probably quite confusing, I know, but that's no problem at this point. This will make more sense as we do this over and over again. For now, just remember what you learned in the fundamentals section, which is that a function is also just a value. And if a function is just a value, then we can also pass it into another function as an argument, just like any other value, like a string or a number. So let's create that function here. And just like before, we do that writing function, and then the curly braces for the function body. Okay, and now all we have to do is to specify what should happen. And to start, what we want to happen is to simply log to the console the value that is here in this input field. So console.log document.querySelector, and actually we already have this code up there, but let's just write it again. So remember that this element here has the class guess, and then from this element we take the value. Okay, and that's it. So let's save it, let's test it, and then we will just go over this again. So I will write 9, and now when I click this button, this 9 should appear down here in the console. And it does. Okay, great. Great job. So let's quickly go over this again. So we selected this button here using querySelector, and then we used the addEventListener method on that element to attach an event handler. And that event handler is this function here. Okay, so this is again just a function expression. So it's similar to when we do just, for example, this, and then just log something to the console. So this is also just a function value, right? And then we can assign that to a variable, and then we call all of this a function expression. You remember that, right? And so here, basically, we did the exact same thing. So we wrote here a function that has a similar format as this. We simply did not assign it to any variable. Instead, we passed it directly here into the addEventListener method. So as a first argument, we had the name of the event that we're listening for, which is a click. And then as a second argument, we have this function value. And this function simply contains the code that we want to execute whenever the event happens. Also, note that we do not call this function here anywhere, right? We only define the function here and then pass it into the event handler. But it is the JavaScript engine who will call this function as soon as the event happens. Okay, that's important to understand. So again, this function will not be called immediately once this script here is executed. This function will only be called as soon as the event happens. And you can also see that here in the code because, well, we don't call the function anywhere using the parentheses, right? And so, yeah, again, we're just really passing it into the addEventListener function. So this works just fine now. Let's try here another number. So now we get 99. And of course, we can also do some DOM manipulation here. For example, let's just, grab this piece of code here and paste it here as well. Give it a save. And now when I click this here, not only the value from this input field will get logged to the console, but also this message here will change. So the text content of this element. So you see, correct number and now 22. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with the game yet. So I just wanted to show you that, but let me get rid of this actually. But now let's actually start to slowly build up the game. So in the real game, when we click on this button here, of course, this number from this input field will have to get retrieved. So let's start with that. And so we already did this here, but instead of just logging it to the console, let's actually save it into a variable. So const guess and then equal this. Okay. And now let's log it to the console just so we see it. And so this should now do the exact same thing, but we first stored that value into a variable and then we log it afterwards. All right. Now remember how I said in the fundamentals section that usually whenever we get something from the user interface, for example from an input field, it usually always is a string. So let me show that to you here now. So again, we use the type of operator that we already learned before. And now when I put this here, we indeed get a string. However, we will eventually have to compare this number here with a randomly generated number. So that's going to be basically the secret number that we will have to guess. And so if we want to compare numbers with numbers, we need to first convert this string to a number. So let's do that here using the number function that we also already used before. And so now let's print both here. So the guess and then the type. And now we get 5. And now it's also here in purple. And we get that it's a number. And now let's start to implement the game logic here a little bit. But just the simplest case, which is the case that there's actually no guess. So usually in an application like this, which has an input value from the user, the first thing to do is to check if there actually is a value. And if there is no value, well, then we can print something to the console as a response. So we can say if there is no guess. And let me actually show you how that would look like. So if I click on the button now, indeed we get 0. And 0 is a falsy value. Okay? And so guess here in this logical context of the if-else statement will be false. So that's what we learned in the fundamentals section, right? So any value that is here in this condition part will always get evaluated to a Boolean. And so since this guess is 0 in this case, and 0 is a falsy value, it will be converted to false. But we want something to happen whenever this is false. And so here we actually want a true value, right? And so we simply use the negation operator to then invert this Boolean from false to true. And so in this case, we can then print some sort of message here to our message field or message element. And so let me again go ahead and copy it from here because we already did that before. So let's say no number, and then as always an emoji here. Let's do this one, or actually it's more like forbidden. So that's the one I used. Let's save it. And so now whenever I click this button, let's check it, then indeed we get no number. Okay? So again, this works because 0 is falsy, and so guess here is false now. But then we use the not operator to convert it to true, and like this we can then make this block of code execute. Because remember, it only executes whenever this whole condition here is true. Okay, and so with this, we implemented the first scenario. So again, usually the first scenario is always to assume that there is actually no input. And then we need to respond to that somehow. Now in the next video, we will then implement all the other scenarios. For example, where this guess here is actually correct. So where it's equal to the secret number. So we will have to generate that secret number then and compare it to the guess. But let's leave that to the next video. Let's now continue building our game and actually implement the game logic itself. And with game logic, I basically mean implementing the way how the game works. So we need to implement what happens when the guess is correct. So when it's equal to the secret number. We also need to implement what happens when the guess is too low or when it's too high. So basically we have these three scenarios. And to start, we actually need to define that secret number. Otherwise, there's nothing which we can compare the guess to, right? Now, where do you think we should define that secret number? Should we do it inside of this button handler, or should we do it outside? Well, the answer is that we should do it outside, because we only want that secret number to be defined once. So only when we start the application. And so that's out here, outside of the handler function. If we define the secret number inside this handler function, then on each click, we would get a new secret number. And so then the game would make no sense at all, right? We just need one number, which we can then compare to each of the guesses here on each click. So let's define the number. So I'm just going to call it number here. And now we need a random number between 1 and 20. And this is actually pretty similar to the dice roll that we did earlier in the fundamentals section. So we use math.random. And so math is basically an object that JavaScript gives us. And on there, we have a lot of different methods. And random is one of them. And it gives us a number between 0 and 1. So let me show that to you. So whenever I run this, it will give me a new number. And it's always different from the one before. Now, if I want a number between 1 and 20, I will start by multiplying this by 20. And so now we have this decimal number here basically ranging between 0 and 20. But all this decimal here is just noise. So let's remove that. And for that, we use math.trunc. And I'm doing all of this here in the console so you can see how this is building up. Okay. And so now I have a number which goes from 0 to 19. Because the result of this here will never really include the number 20. It might only include like 19.999999. But now we're cutting off that decimal part. And so we are now left with a number between 0 and 19. And so to elevate it to between 1 and 20, all we have to do is to add 1 here. And with this, we make sure that the number is always between these two boundaries. So let's grab this now. So now that it works, and put it here. And with this, we have our secret number. Now in the real game, the number will obviously be hidden, so behind this question mark. But now, since we are still in development, let's actually display the number here so that we can then test our game logic as we develop it. So let's select that number. And I think, again, we already did it before, but let's do it here anyway again. Let's just, so the class name is number. And then remember, we use text content, and to set it, we simply use the equal sign. And now, what do we put here? Well, just the number that we just calculated. And now, as I save it, watch what happens. Here we now have our random number. And as I reload the page, you will see different random numbers appearing. And again, for you, of course, it will be different numbers. And you see here 20, which is actually the maximum. So this means that 20 is indeed included in our range here. Just to check if it's all right. So if we don't see any weird numbers, but it all looks okay to me. And so let's now move on and actually compare the secret number to the user's guess. So here we already have the condition, if there is no guess, then just print to the message element that there is no number. So let's again check that. And indeed, it works. But now, what if there actually is a guess? So let's say else if, and now we will actually check if the guess is the same as the secret number. And since I'm always saying secret number, let's actually change the variable name. So double click to select it, and then I can double click on all of the instances. So that's this one and this one. So that's a nice VS Code trick. And so now I have these 3 cursors. So let's delete all of that. Secret number. So the code works the same now, but the variable name makes a little bit more sense. So let's create a code block here. And now we need to specify what happens when the guess is correct. So again, when the guess is the same as the secret number. That's essentially what the guess being correct means, right? So what should happen then is that the correct number message should be displayed. So let's copy that and put that here. And for now, that's actually it. So I'll just give it a save now. And so let's actually test this. So 5, which of course is different. And then in the future, we will want a message here saying that the number is too high. So we're going to do that in a second. But now let's just put the correct number here. And indeed, we now get correct number. So that's exactly what we defined here in this else if block. All right. So I hope all of it makes sense. And now let's work on that scenario that I just mentioned, which is when the guess is greater than the number. So you see that here in this big if-else-if statement, we are covering all the different scenarios that might happen here to this number. So the first one was that there is no number at all, right? Then we checked if it's equal to the secret number, And now we will check if it's greater. So if the guess is greater than the secret number. And then what should happen? Well, let's again select the message dot text content. And then let's say too high. So the guess is too high now. And again, adding an emoji here. So I want this graph here. Okay. And now also, since we are working on this, let's account for the last situation or the last scenario as well, which is that the guess is lower than the secret number. So guess below secret number. And with this, we covered all the scenarios. Let's just copy this one now. Too low. And now we're using the adder graph here. Give it a save and let's test it. So right now we know that it's a 3. So let's try 12. And so now we should see too high. And yes, it works. Now let's test 1, which is too low. And it works again. And now let's test 3, which is correct. And indeed it is. Great. So that's working already. Now let's move on to the next step, which is to work with the score here. So remember that each time that we guess a wrong number, our score should decrease. So let me show that here to you again. So let's say 5 and see how it starts at 20, just like in our code. But now as I check wrong, so it's too high, and now the score decreased to 19. So let me check another one. And so now you see that my number goes down each time that I do a wrong guess. And so let's implement that in our code here as well. So as you see here, we start with a score of 20. And now in these two scenarios where the guess is wrong, so here where it's above and here where it's below, we want to decrease that score by 1, right? Because again, each time that there is a wrong guess, the score should decrease by 1. So how should we do that? And I can think of two ways of doing that. The first way is to read the score from here, then decrease it by 1, and then print it here again. So that would be the first way of doing it, but there is a better way. And the better way is to actually create a variable for the score in the code, and then update that variable. So basically to decrease that variable, and then display the value of that variable here in this score label. And by doing that, we have our data also in the code and not just on the DOM. And so that's always a very good thing to do. So let me do that now, and then I will explain it a little bit better. So I'm going to do that right here after the secret number. So const score, and as you already know, we start with 20. And so that's our initial score. So the value that we set to this variable. And actually this should be a let, because we will then decrease that value, remember? And so it cannot be a const, because a constant is immutable. Now, okay. And now here, let's go back to the wrong guess scenario, or scenarios, because it's this one and this one. And then all we do is to decrease the score. So score equal score minus 1. And maybe you already know, or hopefully you do, that this is the same as writing score minus minus. All right. So we decreased the score, and then all we have to do is to display that score here in this element. So once again, we already did that, so no need to repeat. So it's this one here. So we select the element with the class of score, and then as the text content, we give the score. All right, and that's it. Now we just need the same code also in the other wrong scenario. So where the guess is below the secret number. So I'm just copying this code and putting it here. Give it a save. And before testing it, let me again explain what we just did here. So as I said, we could have also stored this score basically in the DOM. And to do that, we would always just read this value from here. So right from the DOM, then we could decrease that value and then write it back here to the DOM. But then we would not have that value in our code. So essentially, our application would have no way of knowing that score at all points. And so it's always good to keep a variable which actually holds the data in our code and not just rely on the DOM to hold our data. All right. And this variable here can also be called a state variable because this score is part of the so-called application state, which is basically all the data that is relevant to the application. And we could say that this 17, so the secret number, is also part of the state of our application. All right. And so we want all the data always to be available somewhere in our code and not just in the DOM. Okay. So always keep that in mind. And so that is why we implemented the solution like this. So whenever there's a wrong guess, we just take the score that we already have in our code, then we decrease it by 1, and then we display that new score right here. So let's reload. Let's say 17, and watch what happens to our score now. And indeed, it decreased to 19, and our number is too high. And when I click again now, you see it decreasing even more. Now let's try with a lower number. So too low, and our score decreased again. And actually, let's keep going. So let's keep clicking here and watch what happens. So I'm clicking over and over on the same button here, and our score keeps going down, and eventually we reach 0. And at this point, we should basically lose the game, right? But as you see here, nothing of course happens. And we can keep clicking here and go until infinity, and our program will of course not care, because our program obviously has no idea of losing or of winning the game, right? It is completely on us to write all that logic. So basically what this means is that all of this checking here, so doing all this here, should only happen whenever the score is still above 0. And then when the score is actually 0, then we should get some kind of message here saying that we lost the game. So let's quickly do that here inside of this scenario. So basically we need another if statement here inside this already else if block. And that's of course not a problem at all. We can perfectly have one if inside of the other. So what I was just saying is that this here, all of this, should basically only happen while the score is still above 0. So let's do that. So if score is above 0, only then do all of this. All right. And now else, so basically if it is 0, then we want to display another message. So we want to say, you lost the game with some losing emoji. So I'm going to use this one here. So that's an explosion, I believe. So let's test that now. And we only implemented this for when the guess is above the secret number. So let's now use 12. It's too high. And now let's keep going to test what happens. So we are approaching it now. And now we lost the game. But actually I could click twice as my score was already 0. So try this for yourself. I will just reload here and again put a number that is above. So now the score is 1, and as I click, we should get the message, "You lost the game." So let's try. And it didn't happen yet. And it did not happen because the score was indeed still greater than 0 here, right? So we need to change that to greater than 1, okay? So again, a larger number. Now I get 1, and if I click, now you lost the game. And all we need to do is to then update the score to 0 here. So let's just copy this, write 0, and then before we test it, we can actually copy the same code to this other scenario. Now, as you can see, we are creating a lot of duplicate code, and we will fix that by the end of this project. But for now, let's just keep working on this. And the only thing that really changes here is this message. So you see that here is some potential to eliminate duplicate code. But again, we will take care later of that. For now, let's just make it work. Okay, and with this, I think we're actually finished. Let's just test it. So 5 is too low. So let's keep going down. And you lost the game. Great. Now let's test a larger number. And I keep clicking here. And now we lost the game too. Great. So our game logic is already working, and actually the game itself is also kind of working already. There's just two things that are missing here, which is the high score and this play again button. But before implementing that functionality, in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about CSS and how we can manipulate styles using JavaScript. So the DOM actually also includes CSS styles. And so with DOM manipulation, we can also change styles. So let's try that out now. And what I want to do here is to change the background of this entire page here to a green color whenever the player guesses the right number. So when the player wins the game. And we will also make this number here wider than. So let me just demonstrate that here. So let's quickly win this game here. 17. And so you see, we want this green background and also this number here being wider. And for that, of course, we need to manipulate the styles of this page. So the CSS. Okay, so that should happen here in this scenario where the player wins the game. So where the guess is equal to the secret number. And actually, let's add some comments here to make this code a little bit easier to understand. So this one, when player wins. This first one is when there is no input. This is when guess is too high. And this one here is when guess is too low. So this now at least looks a little bit nicer. But anyway, let's now learn how to manipulate CSS styles. So we want to manipulate the style of this whole page. And so what we need to do is to select the whole body of this page first. Okay, so the body is basically this entire visible part of the website. So it's basically this whole element. All right. So as always, we need to start by selecting the element that we want to manipulate. So document.querySelector and then the selector. And now it's just the body element. So there's no dot because that's for classes. It's just really the element name. And since there's only one body, it's going to work just fine. So here we select the body, and now we want to change the CSS style. So here we need to write style. So we access basically the style property of this element, and then another dot, and then the name of the property that we want to change. And in this case, it is the background color. So background. And in CSS, we write the background color like this. Background dash color, right? However, in JavaScript, that's not allowed. And so in JavaScript, all these property names that have two words, like background color, will simply adopt the camel case notation that I already explained you before and that we've been using all the time. So instead of background dash color, it's going to be background uppercase C for color like this. And the same rule applies to all the other property names that have multiple words. So style.background color, and now we set it to something. And let's get the actual color from our CSS. So you see that background color here is the one that we're trying to define, and we will specify it to this color value. So this is a standard RBG value in hexadecimal. And so we set it equal to, then we must write a string, and then the value we want to set it to. So just like before, to set anything on the DOM, we simply use the equal sign. So we have all of this, so the background color property on the style property, and we want to set it to this value. And so we set it equal to the value. Okay, so that's one part. And now let's also increase the width of this number here. Okay, and that's important because I want to show you something there. So document.querySelector, and that is the element with the class of number. And again, we want to change the style. So .style.width. And then again, we need to specify a string. So whenever we are manipulating a style, we always need to specify a string. We cannot just write like a number, like 30. It has to be a string, and in there we need a unit. And now I already closed the file, so let's open it up again. And the number that I'm looking for currently has a width of 15 rem. And now I want to double it, so 30 rem. So 30 rem. And again, it needs to be inside of a string. I cannot just write 30 rem or 30, so just a number. That would not work. We have to specify a string, which in this case contains the number plus the unit. So the same would be for percentages or pixels or whatever unit we use in CSS. Okay, give it a save now. And now let's actually try the correct number right away. So 12. And yes, it worked. Let's actually get rid of the console here. Then the page looks a bit nicer. And we can also, by the way, get rid of the terminal here in VS Code, because even if we close this panel here, this process will still keep running. The only way we stop this process from running is by hitting here this trash can, which will kill the terminal, or by hitting Control C. So let's close it, because this takes up too much space. But yeah, so this worked just fine. Now these styles are actually set as inline styles. So of course we are not changing the CSS file or anything like that. And let me just show that to you. So actually I will need back the dev tools here. Make it a bit larger now just to show it to you. And so indeed, it is an inline style. So a style that is applied directly in the HTML using this style attribute. And the same is going to be true for the body. Exactly. So we see here, this is the background color that we just applied. All right. So of course, not changing the CSS file or anything like that. Okay. And that's it actually. That's really the fundamentals of manipulating styles in CSS. The most important thing to remember is to use the style property, and then on there is where we specify the CSS property. And we need to specify that property in the camel case notation in case there is 2 words. And then the value always needs to be a string. So that's all you need to know in order to change styles like we just did here. Awesome. We're doing great progress in this project, and I hope that you're enjoying it so far and that you find it a lot of fun to be able to manipulate a web page like this. Anyway, in the next video, we will implement this reset button here, basically, where we can play the game again. And so I hope to see you there soon. So as I just said in the last video, let's now implement the functionality of playing the game again. And actually, I will leave that as a challenge for you, because this is already a great time for you to practice what you've been learning in this section. Now, before I give you the challenge, we first need to fix something here, which is that we should actually hide, of course, this secret number. So right now, as we load the page, the number gets visible. But instead, that should, of course, not happen. So we don't want this here, right? So this is where we set the text content of the number to the secret number. Instead, we want this to happen when the player actually guesses the correct number. So let's just cut it from here and move it to the situation where the player wins, which is here. So we display correct number, and then we also display the secret number. And so now you see that we're back to having the question mark. And so let's start guessing. So 10, that's too low. 15, that's too high. And now it's a real game because now we no longer know about the secret number. And 12 is correct. And so now our 12 is also visible here. And the high score, by the way, is also working. Let's just reload the page and do that again. So 10 is too low. 15. 18 is too high, so 17 maybe. So it's got to be 16, right? I thought I tried. Oh, okay. I did something wrong. So 13. So it's got to be 14. And yes, indeed. So the game itself is really working. And so now it's time to implement the functionality of this again button, which will basically reset here this entire interface. So let's go to the challenge I have for you here. And so as I just said, the challenge is to implement the game reset functionality so that the player can basically play again. And then here I'm giving you all the steps to implement this functionality in order to make it a little bit easier and not too overwhelming. Now, if you don't want the steps, then just pause the video now and try to implement it on your own. But probably at this point, it's better to get a step-by-step recipe of what you need to do. So first, select the element with the again class and then attach a click event handler. So that's exactly what we did before with this button. And so now I want you to do the same with the again button. And try to see if you can remember how to do that instead of copying it from this other button. Then, once you have that event handler attached, in that function, restore the initial values of the score and of the number variables. So that are our two state variables of the application, basically. Remember? So the variable that holds the score and the variable that holds the secret number. So this here should actually be secret number. All right. Then also restore the initial conditions of the message, the number, and the score, and also of the guess input field. So basically when we click here, this here should be empty again. Here we should see the beginning message. Here the score should be back to 20. And here also should be the question mark as it was before. And then to finish, of course, also restore the original background color and the width of this number here. Okay, so just take a couple of minutes and try to do this, and I see you in a second. All right, so hopefully you managed to do this. Now it's my turn of doing the work. So we start, as I said, with selecting the button. So document.querySelector, and the class is again. So just showing that to you. So yeah, here it is. So that is the button. And then add event listener. And I'm just using autocomplete here because that's how developers do it. Then remember, the name of the event is a click, and then we need to specify a function. So this is our handler function, right? And by the way, we also say that this is an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. So remember how I said before that usually we assign these function expressions to a variable, right? And then the function gets a name. But in this case, well, there is really no name for this function. We didn't call it anything, right? And so it's just an anonymous handler function. Anyway, let's now go here to step number 2. And so what we need to do here is to restore the initial values of the score and the secret number. So the score at the beginning of the game should always be 20, right? And then we also need a new secret number. So let's just get that from up here. So we don't need to calculate this over again. So we need just basically to reassign the value to secret number. So doing this same calculation here again. Now, if we want to reassign a value to this number, it cannot be a constant, right? And so we need to use a let here. So let's just copy this. And again, without the let, because we don't want to create a new secret number variable. All we want to do when a new game starts is to create a new secret number and then reassign the variable. So I'm just copying what I have selected here. And then down here is where I reassign this value to secret number. Okay. Next up, I want to restore the initial conditions of message, number, score, and the guess input field. So let's again copy this. So here, the string is start guessing. And we basically can get this from the HTML if we want. So this is the initial condition of the message, right? Then we also want to change the score. So let's just grab it from here. And that should be 20. Or actually, we can just set it to score. So to this variable, because that also already holds the number 20. And so that's a bit better than to repeat the same value. So instead, we are just referencing it here. Not 20, of course, it is score. Yeah, that was a silly mistake. Next up, we also want to change the number. So that's going to be this. So number, and set this one to the question mark. And finally, we also want to change the value that's here to empty. So let's copy that as well. So here is where we select that. Or actually even better, because we already set the value before. So document.querySelector, selecting the element with the guess class, and then we can simply set the value just as we did before to anything. And here, what we want to set it to is just to the empty string. So basically to nothing, because that's the empty value here. Remember that the value of an input is always a string. And so the empty string is basically the absence of any value here. Okay, and now to finish, all we need to do is to restore the background and the width of the number. So basically what we did in the last lecture, but redo it once we start a new game. So I'm just copying it here. and then paste it down here. Here, the number is 222, so this dark gray, and here it's 15 rem. Okay, and with this, we should have restored all the initial conditions, which will then make it possible to play the game again without reloading the browser. And that's going to be important later once we implement the high score, because then we will be able to play over and over again without reloading the page, which will then allow us to preserve this high score here throughout the different rounds. So let's just play the game so that we can finish it and play again. So that's too low. 15, 12, 13. Well, we can also use these buttons here, by the way. And we get the correct number. So that's nothing new. But now when I click again, everything should be restored. So let's see. And indeed, everything is back to the same. And of course, we can also do that while we are already playing the game. So let's just do this a couple of times. And now when I click again, this message should go to what it was. This should go back to 20, and it should also empty this field. So you see, that's exactly what happened. Great. So that was hopefully a lot of fun for you. And even if you did not manage to do all of it on your own, it was still important that you tried to do some of this, because it actually was kind of just repeating or reinforcing the stuff that we already did before. And hopefully you didn't just copy all of it like I just did, because as you're learning, the best thing to do is to really type all the code on your own, because that will then make it stuck in your brain. So in your muscle memory, so to say. Okay. Anyway, now in the next video, we will then finally implement this high score functionality here. And with that, we will then have our game completed. All right. So let's now implement the last missing functionality in our game, which is the high scores. And to really understand how the high score should work in this game, let's take a look at the demo again. So let's reload the game and let's start here. And so you see that the score starts at 19. So let's try a couple of times, do a low score. Okay, so correct number, the score is 10, and the high score is now also set to 10, because this was my first game, and so now this is also my new high score. But now as I play again, my score is of course resetted to 20, but now if I do a better score than this 10 here, then that will become my new high score. Okay, and that is going to happen as soon as I win the game. So let's play again. And wish for a quick result. And great. So now my score is 17. And since that is more than the 10 that I had before, that is now also my high score. Okay? Again, because the current score is larger than the previous high score. And so that is now the new high score. Okay? All right. And so basically what we just saw here is now what we need to implement. First off, we're going to need a variable for the high score, right? So just like for the regular score, we also need to store the high score in a variable. So let high score, and let's start this one at 0. This way, the first score is always going to be the high score because it's always going to be greater than 0. Okay. So where do you think we should check for the high score? So basically, if the current score is greater than the high score. Well, remember that here the high score was set as soon as the player won the game. And so where is that in our code? Well, it's here in this if block. Okay, and so this is where we will check. And the check that we will do as I explained previously, is to ask whether the score is greater than the current high score, right? And if it is, so if our score of the current game is greater than the high score that we already had, well, then the high score will become this new current score, right? So high score equal score. And that's it. Now all we have to do is to display that new high score here in this element. And actually, of course, in our version of the game. So right here. So let's check the class name. And it is called the high score here. So just this span. So document.querySelector, and don't remember, you should always write all of this here by hand to really put it into your brain. So document.querySelector and .high score. And I have a problem writing score apparently. So text content, and this will be set to high score. Okay, and that's it. This is the translation of the logic that I just explained earlier. So we need to have a high score variable so that we can keep track of it. And then whenever our game finishes, we check if the current score is greater than the high score. And if it is, that will become the new high score. And so we set our high score variable to the current score here. Okay. Let's just, to make sure, reload it here. And then let's play. Too high. Correct. Oh, and now we have a very high score because we did it in our second guess. Let me actually reload this page here. So I want a really low high score. So let's try it again. So I clicked a couple of times to decrease the current score. Oh, and now we have a score of 14. And you see the new high score is now 14 because it used to be 0, but of course 14 is greater, and so 14 becomes our new high score. Okay, and now as I click again, everything will reset except for the high score. So that was the goal of having this button here, so that we can play the game again, but keeping the high score. Because of course, if we reload the whole page, then everything will be lost. So the whole code will then run again and everything will reset. But here we now keep our high score, right? So let's play again and try to get a better score here. So that's too low. $17 maybe, and yeah, now we get an even better score because of course 18 is even greater than 17. One last time now with a lower score, just to see that it will then not become the new high score. So we always need to test for all the scenarios that we implemented in the code, just to make sure that everything works. Oh, 15 again. And so you see that the score was now 12, but the high score, of course, remained at 18, because this part here is now not true, right? Okay, so we implemented that as well, and now our game is actually functional. It works just fine, and you can show this now to a friend and tell them that you built this on your own with the power of JavaScript. So how great is that? So again, congratulations for making it to this point and for building really your first game using code. Now, it's not really a sophisticated game, but I still think it's a great achievement. Now, in the next video, we will finish up and clean this code a little bit. For example, this code here that we have in this scenario where the guess is too high is almost the same as we have here. And so we can change that a little bit to eliminate some of this duplicate code. There's also some other duplicate code that we can get rid of. And so, yeah, let's do that in the next lecture, because it's also important to really finish up our applications and not just make them work. To finish this project, let's now learn about a technique called refactoring in order to get rid of some of our duplicate code. So, as I said by the end of the last lecture, we have some repeated code in our project. And more specifically, where we can really see this is in these two scenarios, where the guess is too high and where the guess is too low. So here, this code is really almost the same as this code down here. The only thing that really changes is this string here. So this message that we display if the guess is too high or if it's too low. And so having a lot of duplicate code, remember, violates the don't repeat yourself principle. So the dry principle. So right now, all of this code here is not dry. Now, why is it actually so bad to have duplicate code, you might ask? Well, one of the answers is that whenever we have duplicate code, when we then want to change some functionality, we have to change the same code in multiple places. For example, we might want to change the message when the player loses the game. So this one here, right? And then we would have to change it here and here. And in a small example like this, it's not a big problem, but it can quickly become a nightmare for a bigger code base. So try to avoid duplicate code whenever you can. However, when we first write the code, then it's no big problem to start out with duplicate code. And so that's why I did it like this here. That's why we have this duplicate code, because I just wanted to make it work. But then, as we move on in the project, we can use a technique called refactoring. And refactoring basically means to restructure the code, but without changing how it works. So basically, we do refactoring to improve the code and to eliminate duplicate code. And so let's now start to refactor all of this code here that we just talked about before. So the first step of refactoring is to identify duplicate or almost duplicate code like we already have here. So this code here is almost the same as this one, with this string here being the only exception. And so what we're going to do now is a way to eliminate half of this code here, basically. So how are we going to do that? Well, this first if block here checks if the guess is too high, and this one checks if the guess is too low. But in both cases, what we're really doing is to check if the guess is different from the secret number, right? So whenever the guess is different from the secret number, then all of this code here should get executed, right? Where the only thing that changes is this string. So instead of having one big block for the case where the guess is too high and one for when the guess is too low, let's just have one block for the situation where the guess is different. So let me actually add a new else if block here, and then we delete these two, okay? So here, else if, and then this moves down here, and then when guess is wrong, basically. And so that means basically the opposite of this. So here we have when the player wins is guess equal secret number. But here, when the guess is wrong, it means that guess is different from secret number. And so now we can just take this code, which is the same in the two blocks. I will copy it and paste it here. So this is what should happen, except that the too high should of course only happen when the guess is larger than the secret number. So now we still need a conditional to figure out if the guess is greater or lower than the secret number. Now what I'm going to do here is to actually use a ternary operator. And so let me show you how. So I will say when the guess is greater than the secret number, then here the string should be too high. And if not, so else, then it means that the guess is less than a secret number. That's just the opposite, right? And so then we want this string. So let's copy that, put it here, and that's it. So I will give it a save. And now we can safely delete all of this here. Whoa, that's too much. Let's delete it. Or actually, let me just comment all of it so that you can still keep it here as a reference. Now here something is kind of wrong. Oh, and that's because I took away the closing curly brace here. So this one. And so now everything should be correct. Yeah, so you see the red underline is gone there now. And so let me explain again what we did here. So first we unified the two conditions that we had earlier, where the guess was either greater or larger than a secret number. Both of these basically mean that the guess is different than a secret number. And so we just created a block for that, because all of this code here is the same in both situations. The only thing that changes is the message that is displayed on the page. And so here we then basically determined that message with the ternary operator. So here is where we then asked if the guess is greater than the secret number. And if it is, then the text content here should be too high. But if it's not, then the text content should become too low. And remember that this works because the ternary operator is really an operator. And so it will return basically a value. Okay, so all of this here, all this operator will return a value, either this one here or this one. And so then that value is what will get stored in the text content of this message element. So let's now test this actually. So that's too low. Let's try 20. And that's too high. So it means that it's probably working. Let's try 17. Let's try 19. And so it's got to be 18. And yes, everything worked. And so our refactoring here was indeed successful. And I hope it made sense to you. You can just pause the video and review your code in case that it's not 100% clear yet. Okay? All right. So we fixed that by simply condensing two versions of almost the same code into just one. However, sometimes a good refactoring technique is also to create functions. For example, we have the same code here in multiple places. So this code where we set the message. So as I select this code here, VS Code will highlight all the same versions of the code in the entire file. So you see that we have this document.querySelector message.text content all over the place here, right? Well, at least 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Down here, yeah, here, so 5 times even. So that's a lot of duplicate code. And the same is true for setting the number, or for setting the score, or also, for example, for calculating this random secret number. We have the same code here and also here. And whenever that happens, we can also refactor this same code into a function and then call the function in all the places where we have the duplicate code. So basically, we can refactor functionality that we use over and over again into their own functions in order to make the code more dry. Now, I'm not going to do that into all the examples that I just mentioned, but I will do it with setting the message text content. All right. So what I will do is to copy this. Okay. And then I will create a function out here. And the function will be called display message. So it's a function, and the parameter will be the message. And then in the function block, all we will do is this repeated code. So setting the message, and then we will set it equal to the message that is passed into the function. All right. And now to show you how it works, well, let's just use it down here. So instead of this, let me comment it out. I can now simply say display message and then with this string. So this string is now the argument. Okay. And so this argument is what will become the message here in this function when I call it, right? And so then here we say document.querySelector for the message.textContent should be the message that we just passed in. That makes sense, right? And so basically we took this code here, which is responsible for setting the message, and put it into this display message function that we can now use everywhere instead of having this repetitive code. And just to show you that it works, let's now just actually do this. So clicking here without any content. And so now we should see the no number displaying here just like before. And indeed, it works just fine. So let's now go ahead and replace all of these occurrences of this same code. I will not delete them, I will just comment them out, but you can go ahead and delete them from your code base if you feel like it. Instead, let's just use always display message, because that is a lot cleaner. Also, this really shows what we're doing here. So when we're reading the code, we don't have to really understand what's happening. So if we try to read this code like 1 year from now, and if we then come here, we have to try to understand what all of this means here, right? But instead, if we simply have a function called display message, it's a lot easier to simply read the code and say, okay, this here probably means to display a message, and this here is going to be the message, right? That's a lot easier to understand when you read the code later. And that's also an important thing in web development. So here is another one, and this is the one that we just refactored earlier. So this one is going to be a little bit different. So display message, and now here we need the argument. But that's no problem. We can simply do the exact same thing that we did here. So let's just grab this, and now we can comment this out, and actually this one too, and just paste it here, right? And so now, according to this condition here, the argument will either be too high or too low, because the result of this operator, once again, will be either this first string here or this second string. And so that will then be the argument, and the message will then be displayed accordingly. Okay, here, once again, display message, you lost the game. Okay, and down here there's another one. Yes, here. So display message. And give it a save. And so now everything should work the same. And yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, everything works just the same, but our code is a little bit more dry now. And as I said, you could do the same for all the repetitive stuff here, which I will actually not do here because that takes too much time, but you can of course have some fun and do it on your own. But there's really no need to do it. I just wanted to make a point here that this is a really important thing that we do when we write real code. So always keep refactoring in mind when you write your own code. And of course, we will do a lot of refactoring throughout this course. Anyway, with this, we finished this project. Again, I really hope that you liked it and that you maybe showed it to a friend or so and told them that you did it in this course and how much fun it really is to build something like this. Next up, we have another project, which is also going to be really fun because we will build a real UI component, and that's going to be a modal window. So stay tuned for that one once you finished this one and really understood how all of it worked. Welcome back. Let's now start working on project number 2 of this section. And in this small project, we're going to build our first UI component. And that is this modal window that we can see here by opening or by clicking actually on one of these buttons. So I'm sure you've seen this kind of component all over the place when visiting web pages. And so it's simply this window here basically and this overlay which gets overlaid over the rest of the page, right? So no matter which of these 3 buttons we click, it will always open this modal window. And to close this window, as you already saw, we can either click this button here, or we can click outside of the window. So basically on this overlay. And again, I'm sure that you have seen this functionality when visiting other web pages. So that worked as well. And finally, we can also close this window by hitting the escape key on our keyboard like this. Okay. And this is actually very simple and very easy to build. Probably way easier than it looks like. But it will still be very useful to learn how to work with classes. And that's super important because manipulating classes is actually the main way in which we manipulate web pages. Okay. Now here on the left side, I still have the code from the previous project open. And that's because I wanted to show you how to close the live server. So let's go back to the terminal. And so as we hit new terminal, it actually creates a new terminal. So if we want to go to the first one that was already running, we need to go here to this menu here, and then number 1, which is this node. So to change this now, we hit Control-C, and that's even Control on a Mac. So it's not Command-C, it is Control-C. And I guess on Windows, it's going to be the same. But if it's not, you can just click this trash can here, and that will also then kill the terminal. So as I hit Control-C, the process has finished, and so the live server is no longer running. So if I come here to this URL, so this localhost URL plus the current port, which is 8080. So if I now reload this page, it will be gone. So there's no connection possible anymore because I just killed the live server. Okay, just wanted to let you know about that. Okay, anyway, let's now close up this folder here and open a new one. And as always, I already have here the starter files for this modal project. So let's open up a new VS Code window. And let's open up this one. And once again, I have the prettier configuration here, and then the index, the JavaScript, and the CSS styles. Okay, open up script. And actually, we can open all of them because we will want to take a look at the 3 files. Okay, and as before, we still are using strict mode, and so I already included that here at the top of the file. Okay, and now let's get to work actually. Now this time, we will actually start by selecting everything that we're gonna need for this project. So that's usually what we do when we build a project like this. So we select the elements that we need, and then we store the selections into variables, okay? And then we can use them over and over again. So that's way better than selecting the same elements over and over again, like we did in the last project. All right, but in the last project, I didn't want to overcomplicate stuff and do too many things at the same time, and so I just selected all the stuff multiple times. But again, this time, we will have all the necessary selections, so all the necessary elements that we're going to need, nicely organized here at the top of the file, each in its own variable. So let's take a look at the HTML. And so here we see the 3 buttons. So that's these 3 buttons. And then we actually already have the modal window here in the code. So this div element here. So it's already in the code, it's simply hidden. That's why it has this hidden class. And now in the CSS, let's come here to the bottom of the file. And so the hidden class simply sets the display to none. And so that's why the window is currently hidden. All right. So again, as I said in the beginning, in this project, we will work with classes. And so this hidden class is the main class that we will be concerned with. So anyway, this means that we will not basically create the HTML for the modal window using JavaScript. It is already there. All we will do is to show it and to hide it according to the clicks on the buttons. So that's the modal, and that is the overlay. So that's basically this dark part here, which hides the background. And then here we have this button to close the modal window. And so that's all that we need. So again, we need to select the modal, the overlay, the close modal button, and then of course the show modal buttons. Okay, so let's do that. So const modal is document.querySelector, and then just like before, we are looking for the element with the class of modal. Okay, so just like we did in the first project, we select an element using the selector, but then this time we actually store the results of the selection, so the selected element, in this variable. Okay, so that's the element with the class modal. Now we want overlay and then close modal. So overlay, and of course we could give these any names that we wanted, but these names make it easy to understand what they are. So I'm giving them the same names as the class names, basically. So that's the overlay. And now the close modal button. And let's call this one actually a button. So btn, which stands for button, and then close modal document.querySelector. And then this class is close-modal. Okay. And now finally, we also want the show modal buttons. Now, there are actually 3 elements with this class name. So let me show you what happens when we simply select in the same way that we did before. So let's say button, or buttons actually, because we want multiple, open modal, and then document.querySelector open modal. Okay, and so watch what happens when we log this to the console. So buttons open modal, that's the one. And now to actually see this, we need to again start the live server. So new terminal, clear this console, and then all I have to do is to type live server, hit enter, and here we go. So this is our modal window now. And this one we can now close. And actually it has the exact same URL. So it's always this 127.0.0.1, which stands for localhost at port 8080. So if we reloaded this one, it would show us the same thing. Okay, so we can just close one of them. And so it looks exactly the same as the demo, but of course, nothing is going to happen yet. Because as you know, we have no event handlers on any of these buttons yet. But now I wanted to take a look at the console. And yeah. And now here we get null for some reason. So it means that it could not select anything here for this selector. And so let's take a look. Yeah, actually it is show modal and not open. Okay, so let's fix that. So it's not open, it is show. And maybe you have spotted that if you took a more careful look at the HTML than I did. Now anyway, now we see this button here selected. However, as you can see, it is only the first one, okay? And so now we see the limitation of our querySelector method here for the first time. So whenever we use querySelector with a selector which actually matches multiple elements, only the first one will get selected. And so here we need another one, but it's pretty similar. It's called querySelector all. So that's a pretty obvious name, but it's going to do the job. So as I save now you see that we get something called a node list here. So let me open that. And now as I hover, you see that these are actually all of our 3 buttons. Okay. So this node list here is a little bit like an array. It's not exactly like an array, but here for now, it works as though it was an array. Okay. And so now if we want to do something, for example, to all of these buttons, then we can simply loop through this node list and do something with them. So let's actually quickly do that. So we will now again use the for loop. And now I hope there's no need to explain anymore how this one works. So I should stay below the length of this node list, which again, for our purposes here, works just like an array. Buttons open modal dot length, and then at the end of each iteration, increase the counter. And so in each iteration, what we want to do is simply to log to the console the text content of each of them. All right. So what we want to do is buttons open modal, and then we take the current one. And so this here is now an element. Okay. It's one of these elements. And well, now it already logged because it saved the file. But yeah, anyway, each of these here is one element. And so now on each of them, we can simply use the text content property just like we did in the last project. All right. So let's save it again. And indeed, now we get the 3 text contents for all the 3 buttons. And here you might have noticed that I didn't even use the curly braces to define a block. And that's because just like in an if-else statement, if there's only one line of code that I want to execute, I actually don't have to create this block. Okay, I can just write one line after the for loop, and then that's the one that will be iterated over and over again. Okay, so again, this works just fine. And now I have a way of selecting multiple elements with the same class. And then with the for loop, I can do something for each of them. In this case, all we did was to log their text content to the console. But in the future, we will then be able to do real stuff using this technique. Okay, and that's it for this video. In the next one, we will actually already make this modal window work. So don't wait, and let's move on to the next video right away. Let's now actually learn how to manipulate classes with JavaScript. But the first thing that we have to do is to actually react to a click on each of these buttons here. So right now, of course, nothing happens. And so now we need to attach an event handler to each of these 3 buttons. Now we finished the last video by learning how we can do something for all of these 3 buttons at the same time, right? So for that, we used a for loop, which loops over this node list, which is basically an array holding all of the buttons. And so this buttons open modal at position number I is the current button element in each iteration. And then from there, we simply read the text content property just like on any other element. All right. But now let's take it one step further. And instead of simply reading the text content property, we will call the addEventListener method, just like we learned in the last project. Okay, so remember, in order to respond to a click event, we will attach an event handler function to the element. And event handler and event listener are pretty much the same thing. So that's why this method is called event listener. So let's say add event listener and then the name of the event. And that is once more the click event. And then the second argument is the function which will contain the code that should be executed once the button is clicked. So that will be an anonymous function, remember, so a function without a name. And it is, of course, also a function expression, because it's simply this value here. So this function value. So just as I explained multiple times already, but it's important to keep remembering this stuff as we go here through this section. And to start, let's simply log to the console the text content of the button that was clicked. Now here there's actually a mistake, because of course we don't want to log to the console this event listener, right? That doesn't make any sense. Instead, we now want to log something to the console right here inside this handler function. So that's just CL again. And then let's just say button clicked. Give it a save. And now each of these three buttons here has their own event handler function attached to it. So button clicked. And when we clicked on this one, then the same should appear. And indeed, now we have two. So that's what this 2 means. And as we click here, we get another one and another and another. And so, yeah, this worked. So we attached this function here now to all of the 3 buttons. And again, because we did it here in the loop while we were looping over this node list, which contains all of these 3 buttons. Okay, but now, of course, this is not the only thing that we want to do. Instead, we want to display the modal. And remember that this modal is already in the HTML. It is hidden right now because it has the hidden class. If it did not have this hidden class, it would be visible. Let me actually show that. So I delete it, and if I save it now, then you see here is the modal. Right? Here it is. And that's because the hidden class is now gone. And so basically this is exactly what we will do using JavaScript. So removing this class. Okay? So what we want to do is to take the modal, so this element that we selected here previously, right? So we selected it and then stored it into this variable. And so now we take that selected element, and on there we can read the class list property. So that's class list. And then this class list property itself has a couple of methods. And the one we're going to use now is remove. And as I just explained, the class that we're going to remove is the class called hidden. Okay? And we can actually also remove multiple classes. For that, we just have to pass them in with commas like this. So here we then can specify more classes. Just keep in mind that we do not use the dot here. So not like this, okay? And I'm telling you that because I used to do that mistake myself and I remember that. And so yeah, I want you to avoid it. So the dot is only for the selector. But here we are not anymore selecting anything. We're just passing in the name of the class. And so all we need is a string with that name, okay? Now besides removing classes, we can also add classes, and we can even check if an element contains a certain class or not. And we will use all of them in this video and the next one. Okay, and this should actually already do the trick. So when I save this now, and let's click here, and it worked. Great. So the hidden class is now gone, and I can show that to you here using the inspect. And then we need to give it some more space back. And then you see here the modal class that used to be here is no longer there. Now we can of course not close it because that functionality is not yet there, but at least now it is open. Now we also have the overlay, which is this one, which also has the hidden class. And so in order to show that overlay, we need to remove the hidden class from this element as well. So that's easy enough. It's just the same thing again. So overlay dot class list dot remove, and then again hidden. All right. And yeah, beautiful. That's really nice. So using classes like this is a really, really great and handy way of manipulating web pages. And in practice, adding and removing classes like we just did here is the main way in which we change styles on websites. That's because a class basically aggregates many styles in just one class. Now in this case, actually the hidden class only contains this one style here. So this would have been the same as specifying the display style directly in JavaScript. So like we learned in the last project. So we could have done also modal.style.display and then set it to block, I guess, or what was it? Yeah, nothing. So basically, display none means that it's not visible. And if we want it to be visible, we would set it to display block. Okay, so this would do the exact same thing, but you can see that it's a bit more of a pain because then we would have to memorize what exactly we have to write here. So the exact property name and the exact value. And this is only for one style. Imagine that the hidden class actually had 10 properties. Then we would have to write all of these properties here manually and change all their values. So that's a lot of work and it's not fun. And so instead, we can basically aggregate all of these properties in one class that we then define here in CSS. And then in JavaScript, we simply add and remove these classes as we need or don't need these styles. So usually when you need to manipulate styles on a page, then always just export the styles into a class and then use the class just like we did here. All right. Now what we just did here is for showing the modal window, but now let's also add the ability of then hiding it by clicking that button. So this button here. Okay. So right now, as I said, it's not possible to close the window unless we reload the whole page. So let's take this button here that we already selected and simply add an event listener to that one as well. So button close modal dot add event listener, and again waiting for the click event, and then let's specify our function here again. Okay, so again we are just defining the function here. We are not calling it itself. It is the JavaScript engine who will call this function as soon as the click event happens on exactly this element. All right. Anyway, here we now want to do the opposite. So basically we want to add the class back on. So modal.classList.add this time. And so we add the hidden class back on, which will then hide the modal. And the same actually for the overlay. So let's just duplicate this line here and change this to overlay. And yeah, this should already work. So that already worked before. And now let's check it. And yes, it does. And it should work for all the three buttons, of course. And yeah, it does. Great. So again, this is a very common thing to do. We change the appearance of websites and of elements like this all the time using this class technique. Next up, usually when we click outside of a modal, then the modal window also closes. So that's pretty common, right? So what I mean is clicking this area here outside should also close this window. So basically we want this code here to also be executed when we click on the modal, or actually on the overlay. So let's do that. So overlay.add event listener click. And now what should I do? Well, just to make it work, I can copy this code here, but you already know that this is not a good idea, probably. But let's just, for now, see if it works. So if we click outside, so this is the overlay. So as we click it now, then indeed, the modal and the overlay are both hidden again. Great. So this works now. But again, we do not want this same code here in these two places. We want actually the exact same function to be executed no matter if we click the close button or if we click the overlay. So how should we do that? Well, we can simply export this function into a more real named function. So let me cut the code from here, and then I will create a function called close modal. So const close modal equals this function value. Okay, and so now this variable here is what holds the function value. And so what I can do now is to here specify that close modal function. And that's it. That's the function right here. So this here, what we have here, is exactly the same as this. And again, notice that we are not calling the function. We are not doing this, right? This would not work at all because it would immediately call the function as soon as JavaScript executes this line. But that's not what we want to happen. We want the close modal function to be executed only as soon as the click event happens on the close modal button. All right? And now here we can just do the same thing. So again, close modal. And that's it. That's so much better than what we had before. Not only did we make our code more dry, but we also made it more readable, more expressive, and more declarative. So right now, when we read this code here, it's a lot easier to understand. So we just read button close modal at the event listener of close the modal. Okay, that makes sense. So just by looking at this line, we see that when this element is clicked, then we want to close the modal. The same, when the overlay is clicked, we want to close the modal. All right, and so we know exactly what's going to happen when we read this code. And so for that advantage alone, let's do the same thing here with this function. So the one that opens the modal. So let me grab this one, just put them up here. Can also get rid of this console.log. And so let's put the two functions here together. So open modal. And now this function will be just this, right? So I'll just cut it again and paste it here. And so now we assigned this function here to this open modal variable. So once more, a nice function expression. And now we just take that and put it here. Open modal. And of course, again, we don't call it. We simply declare, or we define it here and tell JavaScript, hey, whenever a click happens on one of these buttons, then please call this function that we just specify here. All right. And so this is our code, and it's a lot better. And so actually we just did some refactoring here, and so restructuring our code without changing the functionality. And so that means that our code should still work the same. And indeed it does. We can open and close in two ways, and we can open it on all of the three buttons. Beautiful. That's really, really great. So to recap, if you want to use the same function in multiple event listeners, then you need to specify that function as a separate function, like this one here, and then you can pass that function as an argument to multiple addEventListener methods. So just like we did it here, right? So that's one of the takeaways of this video. And the other one is that we really, in practice, use the functionality of adding and removing classes all the time in order to change the appearance of elements on our page. And that's because classes allow us to basically aggregate multiple CSS properties in just one, like a container. So each class functions a bit like a container with a lot of properties in it. And then here, by adding and removing them, we basically can activate and deactivate certain styles all at the same time. Okay, so keep that in mind and even better, actually write notes maybe with what I'm saying, because this is really important stuff. So working with classes is something that we do all the time. And there is a third thing that we do with classes, which is to check if a class is actually present on a certain element. And so that's going to be the topic of the next video, along with learning how to actually deal with a key press event. So that's yet another really exciting video. So let's now check that out. Let's now learn how to handle key press events. So right now we can already close the modal by clicking the close button and by clicking outside of the modal. But usually there is also a third way, and that's by hitting the escape key on the keyboard, right? And so this is actually a great use case to learn how to respond to keyboard events. So in order to listen for keyboard events, we still need to use add event listener, because the key press event is simply just another type of event. Now, keyboard events are so-called global events because they do not happen on one specific element. And for global events like keyboard events, we usually listen on the whole document. So let's close this terminal here. And now let's write document. So that's the same document that we use for querySelector. And so basically it's a big object which contains a bunch of methods for all kinds of stuff. And that includes the add event listener method. So by using add event listener here on the document, we are basically listening for events everywhere. So no matter where they happen on the page, they will always trigger the event handler that we're going to specify here. All right. Now here about the name of the event itself, there are actually three types of events for the keyboard. There is the key down, the key press, or the key up. Key up, which is, so it's this one only happens when we lift our finger off the keyboard, basically, or off the key. Key press is fired continuously as we keep our finger on a certain key, and key down is fired as soon as we just press down the key. And so usually that is the one that we use. Okay, so the name of this event is just key down, and this event will happen as soon as we hit any key on the keyboard. Okay, and then just like before, we specify a function here. And this time let's specify it here directly, so without creating a separate function. So function, and then the usual way, just like we have been doing. Now, as I just mentioned here, so this function here will actually be executed for any key press that happens. So let me prove that to you. And actually it will be hard to prove because you cannot see what key I'm pressing. But anyway, a key was pressed. And so now as I go to the console and just press any key, you see a key was pressed. And it doesn't matter which one. So Q, 3, P, enter, ESC, any key just renders here the same message. However, we only want to close the pop-up when the escape key was pressed. Okay, so that key in the top left corner which says ESC, right? So how will we know which key was actually pressed if this event here happens for all the keys? Well, the information about which key was pressed will be stored in the event that is going to occur as soon as any key is pressed. So remember, as I hit any key here on the keyboard, a key down event is generated, and our listener function here, so our handler function, is waiting for that event to happen. And anytime that an event like this occurs, JavaScript does in fact generate an object. And that object contains all the information about the event itself, and we can then actually access that object in the event handler function. All right, so again, when an event happened, we can have access to information about that event in the event handler function, just like this one. Now, up until this point, we have never looked at that event. we only just listened for it and then reacted to it, right? But this time, we actually need to look at the event object in order to figure out which key was pressed. And how can we do that? Well, what we need to do is to give this function here a parameter, and let's call it E, which stands for event. So we could also call it event, or we could call it X or QI, so it doesn't matter, but I like to call it E, which stands again for event. Okay, so then as the event occurs, JavaScript will call this function with the event object as an argument. And once more, this works because we do not call this function here ourselves, right? We do not call the function, we only define it here. So we say, hey JavaScript, call this function when a key down event happens. And when you do so, please pass in the event object as an argument. Okay? And we will learn about the mechanics of this a bit better later. But it's probably still a good idea to already take notes of this stuff that I'm explaining. Anyway, now that you know why this function has access to an event, so to this E here, let's now actually take a look at it. So simply logging it to the console for now, and we can actually get rid of this one here. And now I will hit the Enter key. And so you see now we get this event, and it's called a keyboard event. It is just an object that is generated by JavaScript. So you see that here in the console, it actually looks like the objects that we generated ourselves previously. So with a key here and then a value. So a property and a value. And what matters here is basically the key, which, as I said, was enter. So I hit the enter key, and then this event was generated with the key property set to enter. So that's great information, because now when I hit the escape key, then you see that the key was now escape. Or I can of course hit any key. So this was the space key. So you see here that we have a space, or the Q, or Z, or Control, or Shift. And so whatever key you press, we now get this information about the event itself. And in this case, since it was a keyboard event, we get information about which key was pressed. So as you see, the information about the key, I was always getting it from this key property. So let's just log e.key, because remember we used dot and then the property name to read any property from an object. And so escape is now the key that I pressed, or enter, or shift, and so on and so forth. Great. And now that I know which key was actually pressed, I can use that information to actually close the modal whenever the escape key is pressed. So we can simply do if e.key triple equal escape. And then again, let's just log to the console to see if it works. Esc was pressed. And so now I can hit any key and nothing happens. Or actually, some stuff happens because we're still logging here the e.key, but the string that I just wrote here does not appear unless I hit the escape key. So now you see esc was pressed. All right. So that's of course not what we want, but instead we want to close the modal. However, I only want to close the modal when the modal is actually visible, right? And how do we know if the modal is currently visible? Well, if the modal contains the class hidden, it means that it's not visible. And so basically, when it does not contain the class hidden, it means that it's visible, and then that's the condition in which we want to close it. All right? And so we talked in the last lecture about adding and removing classes, but as I mentioned back then, we can also check if an element already has a certain class. And so now that becomes really handy, because now I can do this. So if the escape key is pressed, then we can now check if the modal contains the hidden class. So another if. So if modal and again dot class list and then dot contains and then again the class name. So that's hidden in this case. So if the modal dot class name contains the hidden class, it means that the modal is currently hidden. And so in this condition, we actually don't want to do anything. We only want to close the modal if it does not contain the hidden class, right? And so here we can once more invert that Boolean value. All right, so this not here is very important, as you probably start to see. So let's read this again. If the modal does not contain the hidden class, then close the modal. And so how do we close the modal? Well, we can simply call this close modal function, right? So let's do that. Close modal. And here we do actually need to call this function, okay? Because when this function here is executing, so this one here, as it then reaches this line, of course, something needs to happen. And what needs to happen is basically this code. So we could just copy this code down here, but that's of course not what we want. Instead, we can simply use this function here again, and using means here to call it. So to execute the code that is in here, so this. So let's test this now, and then we can improve the code even a little bit. So we open it. Now I'm going to press just any key, let's say enter. So you see enter. And now as I hit the escape key, watch what happens. Yes, indeed, the modal is gone. Great. Let's see where this button clicked here comes from in line 9. Now that's of course because of this console.log. And let's get rid of this. Okay, let's try it again. Open it on this button. I hit any other key, nothing happens. I hit escape and it's gone. Great. Now let's read this code here a little bit. So basically this means if the pressed key is escape, and if the modal does not contain the hidden class, then execute this function to close the modal. Now notice how I just said if this and then if this. And so what I mean is that we can actually aggregate these two if statements together. And so this is the same as having just, and I'm cutting it here. So it's the same as having just this. Now we can get rid of this stuff here. And that's it. And so now it reads the exact same way as before. If the pressed key is escape, and if the modal does not contain the class of hidden, then close the modal. So give it another try, just to make sure. And yes, that works perfect. Beautiful. And with this, our modal is actually feature complete. It works exactly as our demo here. And so with this, we finished this very small second project. So once again, I hope you liked this one, and I hope you can start to see the power of DOM manipulation so that in the future you will be able to build anything you can imagine just with JavaScript. Now that is of course still a long way to go, but that's also why we have the next project, which is going to be a really nice project to basically train and reinforce most of the things that we already did in this project and the previous one. So the next project is going to be more like a practice project, but I still believe it's very important to do that project in case you have the time. And believe me, it's by far the most exciting thing we have done yet in this course. So I hope to see you there soon after you take a well-deserved break. Welcome back to project number 3 of this section. And this project is going to be the most exciting one, because now we will take everything that we learned in the first two projects to a whole new level and build a really cool and amazing game. And this is the game that I was talking about, and it's called the pig game. Now, this project here is really going to be a practice project. So a project where you and me will together reinforce all the skills that you have learned up until this point. Because remember from the last section, reinforcing knowledge is one of the most important things that you can do to learn, right? So in this project, I will do a little bit less explaining than before, at least about the stuff that we already learned, because we are really just practicing here, okay? Now, if you're in a hurry and just want to learn the basics, please feel free to skip this project. But of course, I would still really advise you to code along with me here. But now let's see how this game actually works. And in fact, you can try that along with me, because this time I hosted this demo on a live website. So you can access that by piggamev2.netlify.app. And the link is also in the README file of the repository for this course on github.com. But anyway, this is more of a real game now, because we actually have 2 players. So you can play this with a friend or something, or just against yourself. So the idea is that we roll a dice. And so now I'm player number 1. So this one is now the active player. So I roll a dice. And so you see that I rolled a 2. And so this number gets added to my current score down here. Okay, so this is my current score for the current round. And this here is my total score. And so let's see how that's going to work. So I can roll the dice again now if I want to. And now I rolled a 4. And that 4 got added to the 2 that I had previously. So now that's 6. And now I can choose to hold this score. So if I click this button, this score of the current round will get added to my total score, which right now is 0. And so when I hold, then my score will be 0 now, and we switched to player number 2. And now I can click roll dice again. So we rolled a 2, and I can hold again. And so now player 2 has 2 points. Now the thing here is that whenever we roll a 1, we lose all our current score, and it's then the next player's turn. And so that's why sometimes we need to hold our points. So let me show that to you. And oh, indeed, I rolled a 1 right away. And so now it's player 2 again. So let's keep rolling the dice. And I will now again wait for a 1 so that you can see that all my current score will be lost. So that's a lot of points already there. And now I rolled a 1, and the player lost all the points. Okay, so I could have held the points, and then I would have added all these points here to my score. So let's do that here. And again, a 1. And so, yeah, now here I hold, and I added them to these points. And I think by now you get how the game works, right? So the first player to reach 100 points then wins the game. But I will now not demonstrate that because that's going to take too long. So we have these 2 buttons here, and then we also have, just like in the previous game, a way of resetting the game. So when I click here, as you might expect, this dice will disappear, and all the scores are set back to 0. And to understand this game a little bit better, for this application I designed something called a flowchart. So let's take a look at that. And this is what a flowchart looks like. So basically it's a representation of everything that can happen in the application. So on the left side we have in yellow the possible actions that the user can take, and then from there we see what happens in the application as one of these options is basically chosen. So as one of the actions is executed. So whenever the user rolls the dice, so clicks that roll dice button, then we need to generate a random dice roll. Then we display that dice roll, and then we check whether it is a 1. If it's not a 1, then add that dice roll to the current score. And of course display it. Right? So that is exactly the behavior that we saw when we tested out the game earlier, right? Now, if the dice roll is actually a 1, then simply switch the player. And so in this case, the dice roll will not get added to the current score. Next, the other option is that the user wants to hold his score, and then we add the current score to the total score. Once that is done, we must check if the score is above or equal 100. Because as I said, the player wins whenever the score is at least 100 points, right? And if it's not, then we just switch the player and the game keeps on running. Finally, when the user chooses to reset the game, we simply set all scores to 0 and set the player number 1 back to being the starting player. All right, so this is a very nice way, again, to visualize what happens in the application, and it's also a very good guide for us to actually implement the application in code. So usually, whenever I build a project like this one, I like to draw a flowchart like this. And it doesn't need to have all this precision right from the start, so we can just start out with a rough sketch without the complete plan of what we're going to build. But anyway, this is very helpful before we actually start writing code to have a good idea of what we will have to do. And if you want to build your own flowcharts that look like this, you can do so on diagrams.net. So that's where I designed this flowchart, and it's a very nice online drawing application that is completely free and really easy and fast to use. Okay, and so now, as always, let's open up our project folder. So I have the starter files here already, and now I need a new VS Code window. And then I just open the pick game. And this time, since the application needs this whole space, let's actually put it here on the separate desktop. And then as we test out, I will just move here from one desktop to the other. So let's make this bigger this time. And so, like always, we already have all our files here. So let's take a look at them. And JavaScript. So here, as always, just the use strict. Then here we have all the styles that we need for the application, and we will take a look at them as we go through the project. And then finally, the HTML file. Okay, and I also actually included the image of this flowchart here for you, so that you can maybe take a look at it yourself to make sure that you really understand how it works. Okay, so take a minute or two to maybe test the app again and check out this flowchart before we actually start. All right. Also, I wanted to show you that I have one image here for each of the dices. So dice 1 looks like this, like 2 looks like this, and so on and so forth. So we have one image for each of the possible 6 numbers. So that's going to be important later. But now let's just start to write a little bit of code here. Let's get ourselves a new terminal here so that we can take a look at the application as it looks right now. And here I like to minimize it a little bit. Live server. Okay. And so this is our live version of the pick game. So again, we are here at this localhost at port 8080. And if you're seeing some other port, that's no problem at all, as long as it works. So maybe you still have something running on this port, maybe from the previous project, and then this project will run on another port. That doesn't really matter. So right now, in the starting point, this is what our application looks like. But of course, in the demo, we don't see the dice in the beginning, and we don't see any scores here. Okay? And so the first thing that we're going to do is to basically put these scores to 0 and make this dice disappear. And so that's going to be basically the starting condition here. So let's go back here to the code, and let me just show you where these initial values come from. So this is the 43 score that we just saw, and this is the 24. And so let's take a moment to inspect the code, because as you already know, we need the class names, and in this case also the IDs, to then identify and select the elements. So basically here we have one of these sections here for each of the players. And you see that the first one is player 0 and the second one is player 1. And I will explain you why the players are called 0 and 1 instead of 1 and 2, probably in the next lecture. So it will make sense by then, okay? But now about the scores, they are stored in this element and in this one here. And so you see both of them have the score class, but then each of them has a different ID. And so this time we need to select these two elements using their unique ID instead of a class name. So that's the idea of score -- 0 and score -- 1. So let's do that. So const score 1 and then document .querySelector. So this is the way that we learned it before. And now here we actually need the hash symbol. So score 0. So actually I'm interested in 0 here. Okay, and so again, now we used this hash because that is the selector for the ID. And the dot that we used to use is only for classes. Okay? Now, when we're selecting using an ID, then there's actually another way of selecting an element. And right now, that's exactly what we're doing. So we're interested in IDs, not in classes. And so let me show you that other way of selecting elements that only works by ID. So let's call this one score 1. And then again, we use document, but then we're not calling querySelector. Instead, we call get element by ID. And then here we just pass in the name of the ID. So just score 1. So without the hash here, because now we're not writing a selector, we are only passing in the name of the ID that we're looking for. Okay, so this works exactly the same as this, but the get element by ID is supposed to be a little bit faster than querySelector. But I guess that's only relevant if you're selecting like thousands of elements at once. So usually I like to always use querySelector, but I still wanted to show you that there also exists get element by ID. All right. And actually let's call these two here score 0 L, which stands for element, because you might then confuse maybe this variable here for simply the score value of player 0, right? And so in this case, we are making it really clear that this is a DOM element. So score 0 L. All right. Okay. So we're selecting these here, and now we can use the variables to do something on them. And again, we do that because probably we will need to do something with these selected elements multiple times throughout the application. And so we just define them once at the top of our file instead of having to select the same elements over and over again. So let's just add a comment here. And comments are also a good way of structuring the code and also of planning how we will build some features. So selecting elements. And so in this project, we will try to get a little bit more used to actually writing comments. All right. Anyway, let's now set these initial conditions of score 0 element. And then, as you know, we use text content, and then we set it to 0. All right. And now the same for score 1. Score 1 element dot text content to 0. And here we are specifying numbers, not strings, but JavaScript will then automatically convert them to strings to actually display them on the page. So if we go now to the application, that should already be in effect. And indeed, you see that now the scores are actually at 0. Great. Now all we have to do is to hide this dice here. And so let's do that using the technique that we learned in the previous project, which is basically creating a hidden class and then add that hidden class here at the beginning. Okay, so let's go to our style. And right now I don't have that class yet, so let's just create it. And I can close the terminal here. Let's just do that at the very end. So we create a class like this, and then we just set the display to none. So that's exactly the class that we had in the previous project as well. Okay, and so now we can just add that class to the dice at the beginning of the game. So that's easy enough, but first we need to select it. So let's call it dice L for the dice element. Let's check out what the ID or the class of it is. And here we see that it's actually just this dice class. So this image with this class of dice. So document.querySelector dice. And so here we have the starting conditions. And now let's simply do dice element dot class list dot add, and now simply the string which contains the name of the class. And that's the hidden class. Give it a save. Let's check it out. And indeed, now the dice is gone. And let's see the HTML here actually. And now indeed, we have the hidden class here besides the dice class. Great. And then as we implement the roll dice functionality, of course, we will want the dice to be visible. And then we can simply remove that class again from the dice. Okay. And actually, that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video. In this video, we will actually start implementing our game's functionality. And we will start with the most important functionality, which is rolling the dice. And let's start with another look at our flowchart here. So that's why I included it in the starter files. So when the user rolls a dice, we want to first generate a random dice roll, then display it, and then check whether it is a 1 or not. And if it's not, we add that dice roll to the current score. And if it is a 1, we go to the next player. And maybe you're noticing that having or building a flowchart like this is pretty similar to actually dividing the big problem down into smaller sub-problems. So essentially, all these squares that we have here on the flowchart are like the sub-problems that we now need to go ahead and implement. So again, for a bigger application like this one, it's a very good idea to draw a flowchart like this, along with the process of solving problems that I taught you in the previous section. So use all of these methods that I showed you together whenever you need to solve a problem. Because in the end, building a project like this is also simply solving a problem. So you know how the project is supposed to work, but then the problem is to essentially implement it yourself. And so you need to divide that big problem that can seem very scary into smaller problems that will then be easy to implement. And as we move through this project, you will see that it's not so scary after all. And with that being said, let's now also see this part of the flowchart in action in the real application. So this is a little bit less abstract. So we roll the dice, and now we roll the 1. So let's just do it again. Let me reload the game as if it was a new game. So we roll the dice, we roll a number, so we generate a random number and then display the dice accordingly, and then we add that score down here. Again, and now we actually rolled a 1, and so we moved on to the next player. Okay. So that's what I just explained before using the flowchart, but seeing it in action is a bit easier. So we want to react to clicking that roll button. So we need to select that button element and then add an event listener or an event handler, right? So here we have our 3 buttons, and actually let's select all of them. So we will need them anyway later. So that's button new, button roll, and button dash dash hold. So const button new is document.querySelector.btn and then 2 dashes new. And now I will just duplicate this line here. So that's button roll, and here also roll, and then hold. So let's just confirm new roll and hold, and indeed new roll and hold. So that's going to work just fine. And now let's implement here the rolling dice functionality. So for that we take the roll button. So that's button roll. And then, as always, when we want to react to an event, which in this case is going to be a click, we use the addEventListener method. Then the name of the event, and then our handler function right here. And since we will not reuse this function, I can simply write it here directly. So let's now write some comments before we actually write the code, because that is very helpful in knowing what we should do. So we already know that we need to start by generating a random dice roll. Then we display the dice. And then we check for a rolled 1, basically. And if true, switch to next player. Okay, so that's exactly what we have in the flowchart as well. So let's start here. So let's create simply a dice variable. And so that's why now we have dice L here for the element, and then dice for the number itself. And this variable here needs to be not a global variable, so not a variable outside here, because each time that we roll the dice, we want to generate a new number. And so let's simply define that variable here. And now we create this random dice roll just as before. So math.random, which creates a number between 0 and 0.9999, so almost 1. Multiply that by 6. Then we truncate all of this. So we remove the decimal part. So that's math.trunc. So basically we pass in the result of all of this into this math.trunc function. And so this will then give us a number between 0 and 5. And so we just add 1 to elevate that to 1 to 6. So that's similar to what we did before. And now we just need to display this dice. Now the first thing that we need to do is to actually remove the hidden class. So remember in the starting conditions, we hid the dice by adding the hidden class. And so now the first thing is to remove that. So dice element dot class list dot remove. So just like in the last project. And now comes the interesting part. So we know that the dice will be a number between 1 and 6, right? And now according to these numbers, we want to display one of these images that we have here. So you see that we have dice -1, -2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so now we want to use this dice number here to, according to that number, display one of the images. And that's actually not hard to do. So let me show you how it looks like in the HTML now. So you see that right now, the source of the image is dice5.png. And if you know some HTML, you know that the source attribute here is how we define which image should be displayed. And we can now actually we can manipulate this source attribute from our JavaScript. And so that's the trick that we will use to display the image according to the rolled dice number. So let's again take the dice element, and then here there is a new thing. So now we can use the source property. So src, just like it is called in the HTML. And now we can set it to a string, and that string will then be the name of the image displayed. So let's use a template literal, and then we write dice dash, because that's basically the common name in all of these image names. And then here we use the dice number .png. And so with this, we can dynamically load one of these 6 images here, depending on the random rolled dice. So let's give it a save and let's give it a try, because this part should already be working now. So let's see. And indeed, we get this 3. Let's actually also log to the console for now this random number, just so we see that the dice is actually the corresponding one to the number. So let's go back here to the console, make it a bit smaller. And now let's roll the dice, and it works. Great. So we get a 2, and so indeed a 2 is also displayed here. Now 6 and 6 here. And let's just see if we get all the numbers. But yeah, we get the 1, and we already saw the 6 happening as well. So that means that our code is correct. Great. And now all that we have to do is to keep adding the rolled dice to the current score. Okay? And so that's what we will do here in this case, where we check for the rolled 1. So remember, that only happens when the number is not a 1, right? So again, if it's a 1, switch player. If no, then add the dice roll to the current score. So basically, let's test here if the dice is not 1. Because this is our main case, so the one that we're mostly interested in. And then our else block, which will be basically in case that dice is a 1. So let's just grab that here. So here we want to switch to the next player. But if it's not a 1, then we want to add the dice to the current score. So let's do this part here. And in order to actually be able to add the current dice to the current score, we need a way of saving that current score somewhere, right? So remember from the first project that we should not just store any data only in the DOM, right? So in this particular case, we should not only display this current score on the user interface. Instead, we also want a variable in our code which always holds the current score of this current round. Okay, so we need to define a variable for that. And where do you think we should do that? Well, it is certainly not in this function. So not in this handler function, because if we did that, then each time that we roll a dice, the current score would be resetted. So it would be redefined, because this function here is called over and over again each time that the button is clicked. So if we want to basically persist that value, so if it should keep existing, then it needs to be outside here in the main program. So let's call this one current score. And we start it at 0. And it needs to be a let because we will keep updating it. So again, this cannot be inside of this function, because then it would be set to 0 each time that we click the button, right? And so therefore it needs to be outside. Okay, and now we say current score is equal to current score plus the dice. And once again, there is a shortcut operator for repeating this variable here. So instead of this, we can just write current score plus equal the dice. Okay, so that's exactly the same, but it's a little bit faster to write. And now all we need to do is to display the score on the current player. Now at this point, we will just display it on player 1 to make it a little bit simpler, but in the future we will need to keep track of which player is the active player. So that we will do in the next lecture. But again, for now, let's just display the score on player 1. So let's select the score or the current score for player 1. So let's check where that is scored. And it is right here with this ID --1 and --0. So let's actually copy that. And then I will select both of these elements up here. So let's do that below this one. And actually, I will keep using get element by ID now. So current 0, and then again element. Get element by ID, and then just the class name, again without the hash symbol there. And then current 1 element is document dot get element, and then current 1. Okay, and so now let's use this one. So let me copy it. Dot text content equals, of course, the current score that we just defined previously. Okay, and let me just add a note here. Change later, because in the future we will need to display this current score at the current player and not always at player number 0 or player number 1, right? But for now we just want to make this functionality work, so let's just test it out for now. So roll dice 4, and you see that it added the 4 to the 0. And now 3 plus 4 is 7, and so it works. And now that we rolled a 1, nothing happened. So in this situation, we want to move to the next player. So basically switching the player. And so that's going to be this else branch. But this one I will leave for the next lecture, because this involves doing a lot of stuff. So maybe you can think about what we need to do, because that would be a good opportunity for you to start thinking by yourself how to implement this kind of functionality. So try that out, and then let's move on to the next video. Let's keep building our pick game. And in this video, we're going to be concerned with switching from one active player to another one. So as we already know, whenever the player rolls a 1, we will enter this else block, right? So when the dice is not a 1, then the current dice gets added to the current score. But if we happen to roll a 1, then we lose all our score, and it is the next player's round. All right. So in the previous lecture, we implemented this functionality of adding the dice to the current score only as the player number 0. Okay. But now we need to make this work for both player number 0 and number 1. And so for that, we need to keep track of which player is actually the current player. And in order to do that, we actually need to keep track of which player is actually the active player in the moment that the dice was rolled. So basically, we need to know which player is right now playing. And with right now, I mean whenever the button is clicked. All right. So we will create another variable which will hold exactly that. So it will hold 0 if the current player is player 0, and it will hold 1 if the active player is player number 1. So let active player, and since we start with the first player, we set it to 0. Because remember that player number 1 is player 0, and player 2 is, here in our code, player number 1. And in fact, let me explain you right away why that is. So the reason is that we will store the scores of both players in an array. So let me do that here. So let, or actually const, because it's an array. So const scores equals an array which will start with 0 points for both sides. And so these scores are actually the final scores. So the big scores which accumulate. Let me show that to you in the demo. So that's these big scores here. So these are the current scores, and these are, let's say, the total scores that keep accumulating, right? And so we are storing these two scores here in an array. And remember that the array is 0 based. And so the score of player number 1 will be here at position 0, and the score of player 2 will be at position 1. And so that's why it will be handy to have the active player variable here also set to 0 and 1. Okay, and we will see that in action actually in the next lecture where we will hold the scores. But for now, knowing which is the active player is going to be important to actually display the current score here for the current player and not just always for player number 0. So instead of manipulating the element of player 0, so the current score of player 0, let's actually select the element dynamically. Okay, so let me show that to you. So we will actually now do the selection right here. Document dot, and actually let's use get element by ID. And then here we need the class name. So the class name is going to be either current 0 for player 0 or current 1 for player 1. And so maybe now you start to see once more why we use the active player as 0 or 1. Because now we can use that variable to basically build these class names, okay? So when it's player 0, we will then end up with current --0, and if it's 1, we will end up with current --1, because that's going to be the active player. So what I just said is to do this. So current --, and then the number of the active player. Okay, and so now on this, we will get the text content and set it to the current score. Okay, so again, this one here will always set the text content on player number 0. But here we do instead select the score element dynamically based on which is the active player right now. Okay, so this is a very handy trick of building the ID name like this dynamically. Now here, when we switch the player, we of course will then need to change that value from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. So let's do that here. So essentially switching the next player means to change that value. So active player. And now here, let's now use again the ternary operator. So we can say if the active player is 0, then we want the new active player to be 1. And else it should be 0. All right. Does that make sense? So essentially we are reassigning the active player here. And we're checking whether right now it is player 0. So if it is, then here the result of this whole operator, so which again is all of this, then the result will be 1. And so then active player will be equal to 1. But if this is false here, so if the player is actually 1, well, then the active player will become 0. And so essentially this allows us to switch from 0 to 1. All right, so I think this should actually work already. So this is the demo, this is the real game. Let's just make sure that it works and reload it. And now as we roll the dice, remember that we are player number 0 right now. So this one. So 3 gets added to 0 is 3, then 7. So this works right now. 3, Let's wait for a 1 so that we can switch the player and see what happens then. Okay, so now we rolled a 1, and so now we should be player number 1. So essentially player 2. And so now when we roll the dice again, the new score should appear down here, right? Because this here is current 1. So this element here is the current 1 that we just defined previously. And indeed, it kind of works. So something happened here, but of course we need to reset the current score. So the current score was just for this player, but now we added that 4 to the current score of the previous round. So as we switch the player, we also need to reset the current score. Okay, so the logic of the active player is already working, but we still need to reset the current score. Also, you see that visually nothing changed yet. So in the real game, when the player is switched, this side here becomes white, and so the background kind of changes there. Oh, and another thing is that this current score here should also then be set back to 0 again. Okay, so basically the previous player should have its current score here visibly set to 0. So let me just show you what happens here when we switch to another player. So you see the current score, and now there's a 1, and so now this side here became white, and then of course the current of the other player became 0. So let's first take care of that logic of changing the values, and then I will show you how we change the background here. So let's go back, and the first thing that we need to do is to set the current score back to 0. So current score back to 0, and then we need to set the text content back to 0. Okay, so basically of the active player before we switch it. So for example, player 0 was playing, and then we switched to player 1, but before we do that switch, we need to change the current score of player 0 back to 0. So we need to do that here before we do the switch. Okay, so basically what we do is the same as this, but we simply set it to 0. Okay, so we're selecting the current player, which at this point is still 0, and then we set his text content to 0, and then we switch from 0 to 1. Okay, and actually we can also set the current score to 0 here, but that doesn't really matter because the current score is not bound to any player. So saving it, and let's try again. So all of this is still working, but let's wait what happens on the 1. So that's a lot of points here. Okay, so the current score is back to 0 here. And now watch what happens. And yeah, nice, that's working now. So now the actual current score variable was also set back to 0. And so 6 plus 0 now on player number 1 is 6. So as we keep doing that, it keeps adding here, and now we're back to player number 0. So this one. Oh, then I rolled another one right away, and so we switched to this player back again immediately. But you see that the logic here is already working. Now, the only thing that's left to do is that visual change. So putting that white background here on this other player. So let me show you in the HTML how that works. And so basically the player that is active has this whole section here with the player -- active class. So you see that this first section, which is for player 0, right now has this class because player 0 is always the first player. But then as we switch to the other player, we want to remove that class from here and basically put it here on the other player. Okay, so let's do that. And as always, we will start by selecting these two players. And this time is actually a class. So player 0 class in player 1 class. So let's do that here and do that as the first. So const player 0 element document dot query selector, and now we need the dot for the class name. So that's player dash dash 1, and I'm just copying it here. I'm too lazy. And this one here is actually player 0. So 0 and 1 right here. And now let's actually change their class names. So the player active class. So down here. And for that, I will now show you yet another method that's available on the class list property. So we already saw, well, actually, let's start typing first. So player 0 element dot class list. And we already saw the remove method. We saw the add method, but now I will show you the toggle method. So we will use toggle now. And what toggle will do is that it will add the class if it is not there, and if it is there, it will remove it. Okay? So we could do that manually also by checking if the class is there and only removing it if it is, but using toggle takes that work away from us. So actually we could have used this toggle method in the previous project of the pop-up, but back then I actually wanted to show you the contains method. Remember that? But now, again, we will use toggle here because it is easier. And so now we simply have to add this player active class, or actually to toggle it. So if we do that on both, then it will work. Because on player 0, it will remove the class if it's there, and if it's not, it will add it. And the same thing on the other player. And since we start with the player active class on only one element, so only on player 0 here, then toggling both at the same time will ensure that it's only ever on one of the elements at once. So let's now check that out. Just to make sure, reload it here. And let's wait for it. It's taking a lot of time. And yes, so we switched the active player and now it's also nicely visible. And yes, we changed it back as well. And so that works beautifully. Great job. And now basically the only thing that's missing to actually make this game work is to hold the current score. And so that's going to be the topic of the next video. And now let's implement the feature of a player holding the current score. And let's again look at our flowchart here. And once again, this flowchart basically represents the division of our big problem, which is to implement this game, into smaller problems, which are all of these green, basically sub-problems here. Now what we are going to implement is the functionality of holding the score. And remember, that happens whenever the user clicks on that button to hold the score. So when that happened, we want to add the current score to the total score, right? So let's see that in the demo version here. So I'm reloading here. And then as I roll the dice, let's roll it again. So I have 8 current points. And as I click hold, you see that these points will basically be transferred to my global score. So in this case, 0 plus 8 will then be 8. And then we change to the next player. And so that's exactly what we have here in the flowchart, followed by switching the player. Now, this switching of player only happens when the score is still below 100, because when the score is at least 100, then the current player wins. Okay? And so now let's implement basically this logic that we have here. Okay. So we want something to happen when the user clicks on this hold button, so button hold, right? So let's take that and add an event handler. So button hold dot add event listener. Once more on the click, and then once more our function value here, the function that will be executed as the user clicks the button. And so let's again write some comments to say what we want to happen here. First, add current score to the score of the active player. So active player's score. And then check score is already at least 100. And if so, then basically finish the game. And if not, then switch to the next player. All right, so now we want to define the current player's score. And remember how I told you in the last lecture that to store the scores, we are using this scores variable. And this scores variable is this array, which at the same time holds the score of player 0 and player 1. So player 0 at position 0 and player 1 at position 1. And so now we can use the active player variable to get the correct score of the current player. So scores at position active player, so that's what I just explained, will be equal that score plus the current score. So we say plus equal the current score. So again, when it's player 1, then this will be scores 1. But when player is 0, then it will be scores 0. And then we take that value and add the current score to it and assign it again to scores at the current active player. So just to make it 100% clear, if player is currently 1, then this would be this. Okay? So scores at 1 is equal to scores at 1 plus the current score. So I'm just going to leave it here as a comment so that you really understand what's happening here. So we changed that score, and now we of course need to display it as well. And so now we will do it in a similar way to as we did up here, where we basically select it based on the active player. So document.getElementById, and now let's just check out again the name of the element. So that's score 0 and score 1. So these are the IDs. And again, we will replace 0 or 1 here dynamically. So again, a template string, current, and then here, the active player. So when it's player 0, it will be current 0. And so that first score will be selected. And when it's player 1, well, then the other element will get selected. And then we can set the text content to the score of the active player. So scores, active player. Give it a save. And so now our game should almost be finished. We will be able to play it basically until infinity, but it should work. But actually, it would not yet work because we haven't yet switched to the next player here. So right now, as we hold the score, we are not switching. So we are not checking if the score is greater than 100, but we are also not switching. And so let's leave that checking if the score is 100. So basically checking if the player won the game. Let's leave that for the end. And for now, let's just switch to the next player, because usually that is what needs to happen. So switching to the next player is this code. So it's going to be the exact same thing. We still need to reset the current score to 0 here, both in our program and also on the user interface, which is what we do here, we need to switch the player from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0, and we need to toggle the player active classes to show which player is the active one. So all of this code here, we will need it again down here. So should I just go ahead and copy it now? And I hope that you already know the answer for that. So that would violate the don't repeat yourself principle. And so what I'm going to do is to simply take this code and put it into a function. And then I will call that function in both the places where I need this code to execute. So I am cutting the code now here. And then up here, I will create a function. So I'm going to call this one switch player equals a function. And this function does not need any argument at all, or any parameter, because the code is exactly the same in both situations. So usually when we are refactoring something, like we are essentially doing here, then there is many times like a small thing that changes in the code. And then it's very useful to have a parameter so that when we call the function, we can specify what changes. So that's what we did when we refactored some code in the first project. But here, nothing changes. All we want to do is to simply repeat this code. And so we don't need any parameters and we don't need to return anything. This is simply just a reusable piece of code. And so let's call that here. Switch player, call it here, and call it here. And again, we will then put this in the if-else statement later once we check for the score to check if the player has won. But now we just want to make the game work. And so, of course, after we hold the score, we need to switch to the next player. So exactly as it says here in our flowchart, except that we're now skipping for now this part. So we're going from add current score to total score directly to switch player. Okay, and so now we should be ready to test our own version here. So now I have 6, let's hold it, and okay, something went wrong here indeed, because our score is still at 0, and that should not be happening. So let's check it out. And let's start by adding a console.log here, just to see if we are actually catching this event. So if we are handling it correctly. So hold button. So as I mentioned in the previous section, we really use console.log all the time to debug any kind of situation. And I could have just erased this part of the video showing you just the final solution, but I think it's a good idea to show you the debugging process right here in the video as well. So let's play and let's hold. And so we got the hold button here. So something worked. And actually, yeah, also the background color changed sides here and the current score was erased. So we already knew actually that something was indeed happening, but let's now actually find out what is going on here. And so now I want to log this value. Okay, so I'm basically now logging the score of the active player, and let me actually do that after I assigned it. So after we changed it, I will want to take a look at it in the console. Maybe the only problem is that it's not showing up in the element, so as the text content. But maybe the score itself is correct, and then we can see it in the console. So let's play again, and we already changed the player. And now I hold, and indeed, here we get 9. So that's the score that we had before. Let me show that to you again, and reload. So I roll the dice, 3, now I have 8, and watch what happens in the console as I click hold. And so indeed, I get the value of 8, which means that the score is actually correctly calculated. Now I just need to fix the part where it is not displaying here in this element. So here I selected current, So let me see. Oh, and yeah, that is of course a problem. It needs to be score. So it's score 0 and score 1, not current 0 and current 1. So that was the mistake. So here is score. And now we can get rid of this console.log. And actually also of the other one that we have with the dice roll. So just make the code a bit better. Now I can close it up, roll the dice, and now as I hold, that should appear there, the number 4. And yes, now it works. Great. So let's play here a little bit. So now we accumulated 13 points. So let's hold them to end up with 17. And indeed, that works. Now let's hold these 4. And so I think this game is really a lot of fun to play, especially if you try it with someone else, which I actually did a couple of times as I was preparing this game, and I can tell you that it's really fun. But now let's actually get to the final part of this lecture, which is to check if someone reached the final goal of 100 points. And so if that happens, the game is over and we should not be able to click any of the buttons anymore. And we also want to assign a special class to the winner player to make it really obvious that that player has won. Okay, so let's add that check now. And so that shouldn't be too hard. So if scores at active player, so remember that is always here the score of the player that is currently active. So if that is greater or equal than 100, then the player has won. So this is where we finish the game. So when we finish the game, we want to assign a player winner class. And let me show that to you here in the CSS. So yeah, it's this one, player winner, which has this darker background color. So let me copy that. Paste that here. And now let's then select actually the player. So document.querySelector. And let's again take a look at the code here, just so we don't make any mistakes. And so the player is really a class, player dash dash, and then the number of the active player. So that is player dash dash and active player. And then onto this element, we want to take the class list and add this class name that we just copied from our CSS. And then we also want to remove the active player class. Okay, so where is that? Yeah, so when we switch the player, we turn on this player active. Right, but now we then need to remove that because otherwise we will have the active player class at the same time as the player winner class. So let's fix that. But we simply need to select the same element again, and then here we remove player active. Okay, I hope that made sense. And now let's test it. And to make it a little bit faster, let's actually test it just with 20. Otherwise, it's going to take forever to reach that 100 points. All right. Well, and before we do that, let's now actually put this switching the player into the else block. Okay. So when the game finishes, we of course do not want to switch the player, but if it does not, only then we do switch the player. And remember that 20 points is enough to win. So let's roll the dice a couple of times. 11, so we're almost there. That was close with 16. And so now we should have enough. So if we hold now, then 10 plus 11 here is 21. So that's over 20. And so now this should then show us the winner player class. Well, that didn't really happen. That's weird. If I keep clicking here, then this number keeps getting added. And let me see in the HTML if the class wasn't added, but actually it was not. So we still have the active player, and the winner class is nowhere to be found. So let's check that. Oh, and here we actually have the problem. So I did a mistake that I told you before not to make, which is when we use querySelector, we need an actual selector. So here we are selecting a class, and so we're missing the dot here and here. So only when we get element by ID, then we do not specify the selector, we only specify the ID name itself. But when we use querySelector, this needs to be a query. And so if we are selecting based on a class, we need the dot here. And so that should be fixed now. But this is great to show you that mistakes like this happen in development all the time. So if you do this yourself, then really don't beat yourself up, because that's just completely normal, as you're seeing here. I didn't plan these mistakes. Anyway, now we have 16 plus 5 is 21, so that should be enough to win the game. Now we really got this winner class here showing that player 1 won the game. So this is now red too, and yeah, the dark background here too. Now the problem is first that we're still showing the dice, so we want to get rid of that. But even worse is that we can still click on these buttons. We can actually still keep playing the game. So you see that everything works the same. And now this player also won. They also have 22 points. But we still can keep playing the game. So of course, that is not good. So that is the next thing that we need to solve. And let's think how we could solve this. And for me, I think the easiest solution is to create a variable that holds the state of the game. So if we are still playing or not. So this is going to be a state variable, which kind of tells us the condition of a system. And in this case, the condition will be, is the game playing or not? And so if the game is playing, then we can click these buttons and then everything will work as normally. But then as soon as the game is finished, we will say that the game is no longer playing. And then we can no longer click on these buttons. All right? I hope that sounds good to you. So let's implement it. And so what I will do here is say, let playing, and now this will be a Boolean value. And so we start with true. So in the beginning of the game, we are of course playing. And so playing is true. And then when we finish the game, we will set playing to false. So that's in this case. So finish the game. And the first thing that we're going to do is to set playing to false. Okay. Now this in itself will of course not yet do anything. So we only defined whether the game is playing or not, but none of our code is reacting to that. So remember that we only want to be able to click on these buttons once we are playing. And so let's define that. So let's go to the first button, which is the button roll. And so basically what we can do now is that all of this logic that we have here should only be executed if we are playing. All right, so that's simple enough. So let's just say if playing, then do all of this. So let's remove that from here and put it down here. And then as we save it, Prettier will take care of indenting all the code and put it nice and beautiful. Okay. Now, playing here is a Boolean variable, and so that's why we don't have to write any condition like this, for example, because again, playing itself is already a Boolean, so we don't need to check if true is equal to true. And so now when we click on this button while the game is no longer playing, then nothing will happen. And so that's the beauty and the goal of having this playing variable. And now let's simply do the same for this other button. Okay, so if playing, then do all of this. And again, I'm deleting it from here and simply writing it down here. Give it a save, and then it will be beautiful and back to normal. And so now, as soon as one player wins, we will finish the game and set playing to false. And so the next time we click on any of these buttons, then here playing will be false, and then none of this code will be executed. And the same here for this button for rolling the dice. So I hope you were able to follow that logic, and so maybe you can use this kind of logic in your own projects as well. And this is actually the reason why it's so cool to start building projects as games. Because in games, we need a lot of this type of logic. And so it's really fun to demonstrate all these different aspects that are quite common actually in programming. So state variable like this playing here, is very usual in programming. And so you can start to get used to sometimes needing a variable like that. And now let's try it out again. And remember that we still can win the game at 20. And just to make sure, let's reload. And now as I roll the dice, so let's hold here. And let's see if we can do it in one run. Oh, and we can. So we are at 20. And now let me hold. And now I won the game here. And now let's see what happens when I click. And nothing happens. The same for hold. So these buttons, of course, like you can still click them, but nothing happens. All right, that's awesome. There's just one last thing to do, which is to get rid of this dice here. So let's go back one last time. And so that also happens here when we finish the game. So remember that we displayed the dice up here when we roll the button. And so let's just copy this and basically add this hidden class back on. So right here, for example. And so now instead of removing it, we just add it back. Okay, give it a save. And let's try to do it fast again. And yes, now we should win the game and the dice is gone. Awesome. So we are almost done here with this project. So our game works really great. All there's left to do now is to implement this new game button here. So we could of course play again by reloading the page, but it's always nice to have a button to simply reset the game. And so let's move on to the next video and do that to finish this project. Welcome to the last lecture of this project and of this section. And in this one, we're going to implement the functionality of resetting the game at any point in time. So what we're looking for when we click on this button here is to remove the winner class and to set all the scores of all the players here back to 0. So all the total scores, this and all the current scores should also be put back to 0. So essentially, we need to set back all the initial conditions of the game. Now, we already did something similar to this in our first game, and so maybe this is a good opportunity to leave this as a challenge for you. And this one will be a little bit more difficult than the one in the Guess My Number project, but you can still try to do it. So what I want you to do is when we click on this button, as I just mentioned, reset all the initial conditions of the game. And it doesn't matter if your solution will be dramatically different from mine. Okay, I just want you to try and I want you to write code on your own. No matter if you actually achieve the goal in the end or not. That is not the point right now. So just pause the video here, please, and try to do at least part of this on your own. So hopefully you had a great time doing that. And so let's now go back together here and do it ourselves. So we need this button new. And so once more, we will add an event handler on there. So that's button new dot add event listener, waiting for a click, and then we want to execute whatever happens here. So as I said, we need to reset all the scores. So let's start with that. And I guess I already selected these up here. So that is score L0 and score 1L. Okay, so these two scores, we want to set them back to 0. Now actually we already did that here. So let's just copy it for now. Okay, then we also need to set all the current scores back to 0. So that is current 0L and current 1L. So current 0L equal 0, and then current 1L also back to 0. Next up, we need to remove the winner class. So this dark class that we have here, and now it's going to disappear because as I move out from this window, it will save and then it will reload. So I'll only go half. But you see this dark class, the winner class, needs to disappear. And so let's do that. And so that should be player 0 element dot class list dot remove and player winner. Now, of course, we do not know which player won the game. And so we have to do this on both the player elements. Okay? And that's no problem at all. So we already know that only one of these two elements will have this class, but we can still tell JavaScript to remove a class even if it's not there. So JavaScript will happily do that. Then next up, we also need to remove the active classes on both players, because again, we do not know at this point which one is the active player. So let's just remove them too. Now we'll just copy it. So player winner here is both active. And then we also need to set the first player to be the active player. So let's do that. And in fact, let me just change the code here in this line, because there's no need to remove it from player 0. Because, well, player 0 should be the active player in the beginning. And so there's no need of removing it and then adding it back. So I will simply add it. All right. And if it was already there, then JavaScript will not add it again. Okay. So just like with removing, so if the class is not there, but we are still telling JavaScript to remove it, it will not give us an error. It will simply do nothing. And if we add a class that's already there, it will not add a second one. And so here, it's not a problem. So even if the class is already there, by saying add player active, we will not add another one. Okay. All right. And that's it for the visible part of the user interface. So we changed classes here and we manipulated the content. But of course, we also need to set our internal state variables back to the initial state. So basically what we need to do is to add these scores back to 0, set the current score back to 0, set the active player back to the first player, and also basically start the game again by setting playing back to true. So what should we do here? Should I simply take this code and copy it to the other function? And you already know the answer to this question, don't you? So of course not. Instead, we will create a function which contains this code together with the code that is already down here. Okay, and then we will create a new function with all of this. And I'm going to call this function init, which stands for initialization. So let me cut this code here and create this function here. So again, calling it init which stands for initialization. And this is once again just a function that serves as a reusable piece of code. So we need no arguments here. Okay, so this is the init function, which will initialize our game. And now we also want this code in there as well. And in fact, we want all of this code. So all of the starting conditions should now be set here in this init function. So let's grab this and paste it here. Okay. And now these two are duplicate. So they're already down here. So this is the same as this and this. So let's remove it from here. And then let's move this one down a little bit. Okay. And again, I used Option or Alt arrow down to move the line like that. Give it some space here. And okay. So this is our initializing function. Now, when do we want this function here to be executed? We want it in two situations. So whenever we load the page for the very first time, or also when that button is clicked that we were just working on, right? So of course, we need the scores to be 0 at the beginning, together with the current score and the active player and all of that. And so we used to have this code outside of any function. And so it was executed right when the file was loaded. But now this code is inside of this function. And right now we are not calling this function here at any point. And so this code in here will not get executed as the page loads. Okay, so right now, as we load the page, you will see that it has these weird starting conditions that it had initially. So showing these random numbers and showing the dice. And nothing is going to work now if I click any of this. And so that's because our initial variables here are not set, because this function does not run on its own. And so, as you might guess, the solution to that is to simply run it. So as we now load this script, then JavaScript will find this function definition, and then it will find this line of code which runs the function. And so then, by that time, all of this code here will be executed, and then our game will work just fine. So let me show that to you. And so now we are back to looking normal, and our game should work. Oh, and actually nothing is working. So let's take a look at the console. But I can already guess what is happening. Okay. And so, yeah, we see here from these errors that these variables are not defined. Playing is not defined. And yeah, but it's not the only variable that is not defined. And so let me show you the error here. So this error comes from something that we already talked about very briefly before, but I didn't really go into yet. That's because in the next section, we will really get deep into something called scoping. Okay? But let me just explain to you right now that these variables that I defined here, they're only available inside of this init function. Okay, so again, this scores, this current score, this active player, and this playing, all of these variables, I declared them in here inside of this function. And so because of that, they are not accessible outside of the function. So we say that they are scoped to this init function because this is where I declared them. And so the solution is to declare these variables outside of any function, but without any value. And so it's then in the init function where they will really be declared. Okay? And if that doesn't make 100% sense, it will make after the next section where we will really understand deeply how scoping like this works. Anyway, let's now declare these 4 variables here outside. So I will use let now for all of them. So scores, and then remember, as we already did in the fundamentals section, we can define a bunch of empty variables by using commas here. So current score, active player, and playing. So now these variables, they basically live outside here. And so what we do here then is to essentially reassign them a value. So we need to get rid of these lets here, because that would then create new variables here. But again, that's not what we want. We want the variables basically to live out here, and then in the init function, we only reassign their values. So that's very different. So declaring a variable is not the same as assigning them a value, okay? And so right now here, we only assign them a value, but they still live outside here, and that's why they are then accessible in every function everywhere. All right. And now just to finish, we also need to use this init function, of course, on the reload function. So on this event handler here. And so, just like before, here we now do not declare this anonymous function, but instead we pass in the init function, which again is really just a value. And so it's perfectly okay to pass this value into this other function. And just keep in mind that we do not call this function here. It is JavaScript who will call the init function as soon as the user clicks on the new button. And so now everything will work just fine. So we get 5 down here. And let's hold it now. And indeed, we moved to the other side. And with this, we should win the game now. So let's see. Hold, and indeed. And now here comes the test to see if this button works. And indeed, it does. And we can restart the game just like this. This time, let's player 2 win the game here, just to see if it works there as well. So that's enough points. And indeed, it works. But what matters is now that as we click the new game button, everything is back to normal and player 1 is back to being the current player. All right, great. And with that, we actually finished the game, almost finished. Let's set the threshold here back to actually 100 points. So that is the limit here on which we want this game to finish. But with that, the game is ready and feature complete. And yeah, I hope you're happy with it. So congratulations, great job for making it to the end of this section. That's already a really great achievement. And I hope that you can see that you already learned a lot of new stuff here. And now you can go ahead and play this game with your friends, and you can tell them that actually you coded this by yourself. So the code you wrote on your computer is what made this program possible. It's what makes this really come to life, so to say. So how cool is that? And maybe even your friend will then become interested in programming and you can do this journey together. But anyway, with this, we now really finished the fundamentals part of this course. And once again, I really hope that you can see that you already learned a lot of new concepts here in this last couple of hours. So congratulations once again, and I see you in the next section, which is really important because there you're going to learn how JavaScript actually works behind the scenes.